Ghostly Love, The Good Witch Matchmaker, Book 2. Written by Kate Lawley. Narrated by Sonia Field. "How do you feel about breaking a curse?" she asked the mirror.
"Completely uninterested,"
Bedivere's disembodied voice replied.
"No, actively opposed."
The mirror rippled, but not with the vehemence of strong emotion. "And if we're discussing the Sherwood boy?" The glass brightened, then returned to its normal silvery flatness.
"Now that, my darling, is another question entirely. The timing could be better, but perhaps. You've devised a reasonable solution?"
Glenda smiled. "I have a spell, some favorable predictions, and a girl. I need a potion, a mild compulsion potion, nothing too terribly complex for you, of course. But it's vital, and with compulsion."
"That pesky free will concern. Mustn't make the mortals work against their natural inclinations, must we?"
A sigh rippled across the glass, a rather dramatic sigh.
"Your mathematical predictions aside, you've personally vetted the girl?"
"Naturally. Even the best magical math can only predict the probable future," Glenda said. She stared into the depths of the glass looking for some sign. Without the potion, without his potion, her chances of success decreased significantly. Compulsion potions needed a very practiced hand. Time ticked by.
"I assume you have an appropriate item upon which to apply the potion?"
When she murmured an assent, he said,
"I'll do it."
She swallowed the triumphant smile that threatened to break free, certain he'd hear it in her voice. "Let's break this curse, shall we?" Chapter 1. Hillary wanted to be happy for her best bud. That wasn't fair. She was happy for Beth. She could do without the envy, though. Her skin practically illuminated the kitchen with its greenish glow. She was that disgustingly jealous. "Have you guys set a date yet?" Hillary retrieved the wine bottle from the island and refilled her glass. "We're not engaged. Not yet." Beth shrugged her shoulders and grinned. "He wants to get settled into his apartment, get the basics for his new business rolling, and then he's going to ask, when the time is right." And just like that, Hillary's nasty green monster melted. She adored Beth, and Beth deserved this. "Only you would think that's romantic. Edward doesn't actually have to work. He does understand that, doesn't he?" "Of course he does. He's got a very good head for money, but he's convinced that normal people work in this day, so he's going to work." Beth's lips quirked in amusement. "He's just lucky he can pick something he enjoys. You wouldn't believe how excited he was to find out he could sketch pictures all day long and people would pay for them. Big surprise to me. There's actually a market for what he does. One of my friends has already commissioned him to illustrate her new children's book." "One with lots of animals, I'll bet." Hillary had seen several of Edward's critter drawings. Apparently, being an amateur naturalist back in the Victorian era meant an eye for detail. But she couldn't imagine that his level of artistic talent had been common. She'd seen his artwork, and he was truly fabulous. "I think the current market would be more fanciful." "Yes and no. There's a market for his realistic renditions, but he's also exploring a more child-friendly, fantastic style, hence the book illustrations. He's having a blast." Beth grinned. "And it doesn't hurt that a slow build to the business isn't a problem." "Well, his monkeying about, personally fulfilling or not, means that your wedding is delayed, which also means that Mr. Conservative Victorian gentleman won't be moving in with you for ages. How long is that lease he signed again?" Hillary swallowed a good gulp of red wine. "I don't see how you find the patience." "Only 6 months, but renewable month to month. But it's not a problem. If it was, he'd have already proposed, whisked me off to the registrar's office, and moved in." Beth grabbed the wine off the island and took a drink straight from the bottle. "Besides, it's not like we don't spend time alone. He's not that conservative." "I can't believe I'm saying this, but spare me the details. And put the wine bottle down, wild woman." The doorbell rang before Hillary could give Beth any more grief over loose morals and rude table manners. Beth left to answer the door, but was only gone a minute. "Hillary, you won't believe who stopped by. Glenda." A woman stepped into the kitchen. She'd coiled her tawny golden hair into a chignon that managed to look elegant without pretension and avoided the dated feel of some updos. With its excellent cut and tailored fit, her dress flattered a trim figure but wasn't revealing. A fine silver chain, strong but thin, hung around her neck. And attached to that pretty piece of jewelry were the gaudiest vintage cat-eyed reading glasses Hillary had ever seen. Encrusted with crystals, they looked like they'd been bedazzled by an overzealous 12-year-old. And Hillary absolutely adored them. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Hillary offered her hand. "I never seem to be at the shop when you're in town." Glenda shook her hand and then smiled, meeting her gaze directly. "Yes, I do travel quite a bit. You're one of several regular buyers I've managed to miss over the last few years. I'm rarely in one place for long, first with one thing and then another. Work." Glenda fluttered her hands helplessly. And if that wasn't suspicious, Hillary didn't know what was. This woman couldn't be less helpless, and while she certainly traveled for work, she owned several vintage stores in different cities. Hillary suspected one thing and then another was code for her magical machinations. "Glenda stopped by to drop off my birthday present for you, which has already been safely secured in the hall closet. No peeking, no touching, no shaking." Beth pivoted to Glenda and, not allowing Hillary any time to argue, asked Glenda, "Can I get you something to drink?" "No, thank you, I have to be going, but Hillary." Glenda turned brilliant green eyes on Hillary. "Yes?" Looking at those eyes, Hillary wondered if their witchy acquaintance wore colored contacts or if her intensely colored eyes might be an indication of her magical powers. Hillary had to choke back a snort at her overactive imagination. The woman probably just had exceptionally attractive eyes, further enhanced by cosmetics. Glenda pulled the silver chain and reading glasses over her head, deftly avoiding mussing her hair. "I noticed you admiring my glasses, and they don't quite suit me, much as they originally caught my fancy. I hope you'll give them a good home." "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly." Hillary hadn't realized she'd been quite so obvious, but the glasses had certainly caught her attention. "An early birthday present." Glenda flashed a charming smile. "I insist." Hillary closed her fingers around the spectacles. "Thank you." To deny the offered gift a second time would be rude, wouldn't it? It wasn't until Beth had escorted Glenda out and Hillary stood in the kitchen holding her recent acquisition that she realized she'd just received a gift from a witch. Beth walked in and eyed the glasses suspiciously. "You remember the journal she wanted me to buy, and how I bought it even though my initial inclination was to pass? That book seemed innocuous enough, but it turned out to be magically booby-trapped." "Ugh, why didn't you say something before I took them? The thought didn't even cross my mind until she left." "I doubt she'd actually say. She's secretive that way." Beth tipped her head. "Maybe not secretive, but she's certainly not straightforward, and definitely working on her own timeline." "Ha! Says the girl with the time-traveling boyfriend." Hillary inspected the glasses, looking for some sign that they were other than they appeared. "I'm surprised you accepted them." "Well, I didn't think they were cursed, magicked, or enchanted when I took them, did I? And you know how much I love presents." Hillary ran her finger over the crystals. "They're deliciously obvious, aren't they?" Beth shook her head. "Not really my style, but I'm glad you like them." "Well, truth be told, I give her business, the Good Witch, a lot of money, so I don't feel bad." Hillary grabbed her phone from the kitchen island and scrolled through her contacts. "But I do want to know if these are going to send me back to the 50s. She tapped the screen and assumed her bubbly buyer persona. "Hi, this is Hillary Barrett." "No, that's fine. I wasn't calling about that. Actually, I wanted to chat with Glenda. You don't happen to have a direct number for her that I can try, do you?" "That's all right. No message. Thank you."
"Uh-oh, what's up?" Beth asked.
"Our witch is fleeing the country, and sales lady Tiffany, who I know and don't think would lie outright to me, says that Glenda doesn't have a cell phone."
Beth's eyebrows rose.
Really? That's weird. No, her being a witch is weird. Not having a cell phone is antiquated, inconvenient, annoying, but worst of all, so 1990s. We keep calling her a witch, but what exactly does that mean? Maybe she doesn't need a phone like you and I do. No cell? Magic doesn't preclude the need for normal human communication, and that means a cell. That's especially true if she's scattering magical items around like candy. Did it occur to you that if these glasses are enchanted in some way, our witch has targeted me for some magical nonsense? Hillary couldn't keep a grin from spreading. Which is kind of cool. Beth eyed her askance and took a swig of wine from the bottle. Sorry, I think. Hey, why the 50s? You said you could end up in the 50s. Yeah, these are vintage, circa mid-50s. Your journal was from the late 1800s, and you ended up in Victorian England, so maybe I'll end up in 1950s Hollywood. Or, 1950s Iowa. Beth's lips twitched. Just saying. Give a girl a break. And while I'm thrilled that you found your long-lost soulmate and you guys can geek out reading old books together for the rest of your lives, I doubt I'll actually go anywhere, or when. But if I did, it better darn well be Hollywood and not Iowa. And she had commitments here, and time travel was crazy. But it would certainly be something different. Chapter 2. So she'd uncovered a little bitterness earlier, just a wee tiny bit. Hillary sighed. Beth would forgive her because her best bud was clever, and she'd know how hard it was to be left behind. And there was no question, Beth knew how happy Hillary was for her. Hillary picked up the sparkly glasses from the passenger seat of her little Fiat. With one hand on the steering wheel, she ran the fingers of her free hand along the faceted stones. Now she had the possibility, however unlikely, of her own adventure. A daring little sprint back into a decade that had a flair for fashion and an appreciation of glamour. So they had some backward ideas about women, but it wasn't like she was moving there. She'd be visiting. Probably. And really, what were the chances of anything at all happening, let alone getting stranded? Eek! Living indefinitely in the 1950s was a less than thrilling prospect. No gel manicures, no cell phones, no extensions, the potential for very bad color jobs. She checked the time. Still on track to arrive promptly at her Gramps' place. Oh yeah, and then there was that. She had people who needed her in the present. Well, one person at least. What would her grandfather do without her? Actually, it wasn't her grandpa who was the problem. The question was, what would her sneaky, conniving aunt and uncle do? The plotting duo would have a field day if Hillary disappeared from the scene. Gramps might have faith in his kid's good intentions. Hillary did not. Easy come. Hillary chucked the offending glasses on the passenger seat. Easy go. If Glenda used the same tactics as before, Hillary would probably have to wear the glasses to trigger her trip to the 50s. Piece of cake. She wouldn't put them on. She raised a haughty eyebrow at the glasses. No, I won't. She turned into her grandpa's neighborhood. If she didn't check on him at least 2 or 3 times a week, she worried that something might happen. Not that Gramps wasn't completely capable of caring for himself, just the opposite. He walked a mile twice a day, had better eyesight than most 75-year-olds, and cooked a much meaner meal than Hillary. No, it was her evil, overbearing family she was worried about. After she pulled into Gramps' driveway and parked, she leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. If the decor-challenged house wasn't worth so much, if her aunt and uncle only spent a little more time with him, if everyone would just accept that the house meant much more to him than it did to everyone else, if everyone would stop for a moment to consider what the loss of his independence would do to Gramps. Who was she kidding? Even if all those things were true, that didn't take care of Brad. Hillary pressed at the inside corners of her eyes with her forefingers. Gramps would spot red or overbright eyes in a heartbeat. He had exceptional eyesight. The business with Brad started about 7 years ago. Every once in a while, Gramps would mention his buddy Brad. At first, the family thought he'd made a friend in the neighborhood. It didn't take long for Hillary to realize that Brad was a figment of a lonely widower's overactive imagination. She wasn't concerned because he was lucid, sharp even, in every other way. So what if he was a little lonely and made up a cool guy to keep him company? But she didn't think the family would be so generous, so she discouraged him from speaking about Brad with the rest of the family. Mom and Dad weren't a problem. They lived out of state, so just about everything to do with Gramps flew over their heads. But Aunt Carol and Uncle Tim lived locally. Maybe she judged them too harshly, but Hillary thought the steadily increasing value of Gramps' old house had something to do with Carol and Tim's recent escalating interest in placing him in a home. Of course, they didn't call it a home. And they swore he'd love living there. Right. Just like he'd love it when they demolished the house he'd lived in all of his adult life. Unfortunately, it was the property that was valuable, because renovating a dated 3,000-square-foot house from the 50s would cost much more than tearing it down and throwing up a box mansion twice that size. A tap on her window startled her out of her thoughts. She smiled and rolled her window down. "Sorry, Gramps. Lost in admiration of my new nail color. What do you think?" She flashed him what was actually a 3-day-old manicure. He squinted, a sure sign of an attempt to think of something positive, then said, "Very shiny. How about a little dinner? That is why you're here, isn't it? So I can feed you?" He started back inside the house without waiting for a response. She rolled up her window, checked her mascara and eyeliner surreptitiously for smearing in the rearview mirror, and then hopped out of the car. Jogging up behind him, she said, "You know me too well. I'm always interested in a free meal." Once they were inside, Gramps gave her a big hug. "Always good to see you, Peanut." Gramps waited until they'd finished their meal and were having an after-dinner espresso, his espresso machine only one of several surprisingly modern gadgets he'd picked up in the last few years, to spring his bad news. "I've got an appointment with some lady doctor next week." Hillary tapped a nail on the table. "A lady doctor, huh? Not just a doctor?" As modern as he could be, in some ways her Gramps was a stodgy old dude. But regardless, his GP was a man. "Why the new doctor?" "Tim and Carol thought—" "Stop there. Tim and Carol? Is your new lady doctor a psychiatrist?" Hillary flipped her hair behind her ear and leaned forward. "Calm down. Hey, put that phone away. It was either go voluntarily or have the court require an evaluation. We don't want that, do we? It's better this way." Hillary stopped mid-dial. "Is it better? Do you know that for sure? I think we should hire you an attorney." Grandpa leaned back in his 1976 kitchen chair and crossed his arms. "No." Hillary sighed. They'd had this conversation, or at least one like it, before. Tim and Carol were family. He loved them. They loved him. They certainly didn't mean any harm. Blah, blah, blah. Her well-shaped tush, they didn't mean him harm. What else was tossing him in an old folks' home but harm? An active, healthy, with-it guy like Gramps should only move to a retirement community if he wanted to. And who was she kidding? Tim and Carol had picked out an old folks' home, not a retirement community. "Stop," Walter said. "Whatever you're thinking or scheming, just stop. I'm doing the evaluation. It's no problem because I'm not crazy." "It's not about crazy or not. It's about whether you can make responsible financial decisions for yourself, Gramps." Hillary hated to say it out loud, but "I'm afraid they'll trick you." He uncrossed his arms and his eyes softened.
"Am I so gullible?"
Hillary groaned. "You're terrible. You couldn't even tell me my nail polish looks nice. You're honest to a fault. And any mention of Brad will put your credibility in doubt." She had an unpleasant thought. "Your new phone? The one with all the bells and whistles? Brad?" Grandpa shrugged.
"He's better with the online research. He said it was the best one, but I find all the YouTube videos with the people who tell you how to do everything. Brad can't work the mouse thing or the keyboard on the computer."
"Oh, Gramps." Hillary was sick. How could he not see it? "Your imaginary friend tells you to buy things. You know and I know that you're not going to spend all your money on some pyramid scheme or some other scam. But do you understand how listening to the advice of a guy who doesn't exist might be a red flag for a psychiatrist who's evaluating your ability to make responsible financial choices?
It'll be fine, Peanut. You worry too much.
Hillary couldn't budge him on the evaluation. He was going, and that was that. And when she asked in a fit of pique what Brad thought about it all, she was a little surprised that Brad was on her side. As she drove back to her house, she couldn't decide exactly what that meant. But on a positive note, it was some evidence that Brad didn't hold ultimate sway over her grandpa's decisions. Some comfort that was. Chapter 3. Brad no longer crept into rooms, worrying he'd give Walter a heart attack. The old guy didn't even blink when his ghostly roommate moved silently from room to room. So Brad didn't worry over much that Walter didn't immediately notice his presence in the kitchen.
She's concerned. I don't know why. I'm fitter now than I was 8 years ago.
Walter didn't even look up as he continued to load his dishwasher. Brad didn't point out that from what he knew of Walter's life 8 years ago, he hadn't been doing all that well. His wife Ingrid had passed from an aggressive form of brain cancer, and Walter hadn't handled it well.
You do know why. You can't have an imaginary friend. People start talking dementia, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, crazy old guy. Any label that lets them explain away why you're seeing and hearing things that no one else can. I don't think it will matter that you're otherwise completely rational. Call it what it is, son. Hallucinating.
Walter looked over his shoulder.
And no one would think I'm losing my mind if you'd show yourself to the rest of the world. We've talked about this. I promise, Walter, I've tried and tried and tried. I don't know why, but you're it. You're the only one who can see me. I love you, man, but having only one person to talk to for 7 years? Come on, that's not how I'd choose to live. Being dead stinks, Walter grumped. Amen to that.
Brad couldn't argue, although after all this time, he still didn't feel dead. Walter hypothesized it was Brad's inability to let go of life, of a particular person, of a certain problem that continued to tether him to this plane of existence. Maybe Walter was right, because Brad wasn't ready to let go. And fortunately, after Brad had shown up 7 years ago, Walter had decided he wasn't ready to stop living either. They'd started walking together, sharing stories, watching TV, hanging out. And Walter had gotten fitter and slowly climbed out of a depressive funk. Win-win as far as Brad was concerned. Walter was a great guy, and both of them had needed a buddy to get them through a rough patch. Brad's rough patch, death, just happened to be a little more permanent. Walter pulled out a glass and retrieved his favorite whiskey stones from the freezer.
Still wonder why that psychic gal couldn't see you.
As Walter poured himself a few fingers of whiskey, Brad considered the question.
My guess? She was a fake. Maybe we should try again. Do you think Hillary would bring her new psychic, that lady Mary Margaret?
Brad sat down at the kitchen table. However this ghost stuff worked, he was glad he had just enough ectoplasm, or whatever made up his physical presence, to interact with physical objects. He couldn't imagine hovering for eternity. Walter sat opposite him and scratched his day-old beard. Brad had finally convinced him that he didn't have to shave every day, that the ladies liked a little scruff. Mostly he got sick of watching the guy nick himself. How could a guy shave for more than 50 years and be so bad at it? Finally, Walter said,
I don't know. Hillary said this one doesn't see ghosts, just auras. I don't get the difference. I could have an aura, right? Besides, this one seems less sketchy. Even the name is solid. I mean, Mary Margaret? Are we sure she's not a nun? Ha! A psychic nun. No, not a nun.
Walter shook his head and chuckled again.
I have to say, before you, I always thought Hillary was a little loony about the psychics and the crystals and the tarot. Guess I was wrong about some of that stuff.
He took a sip of whiskey, then said,
Yeah, okay, I'll ask her. This Mary Margaret does seem like a straight shooter. Now, that Madame Celeste, she was another story altogether.
The two men shared a lengthy silence, Walter sipping his whiskey and Brad wishing he could have a whiskey. Finally, Walter said, "It's hard not to talk about you. We spend a lot of time together." Walter raised his bushy but recently and neatly trimmed eyebrows. "A lot." "Tell me about it." Brad clasped his hands together on the table. He thanked God, or whoever was pulling the strings of his fate, every day for Walter. Before he'd stumbled on Walter in his previously unkempt and depressed state, Brad had been homeless, nameless, and completely without hope. Walter had given him a name and a home. But more than that, Walter had given him purpose. Life had been grim in those months before meeting his roommate. "Hey, didn't you want to show me your new phone?" Walter smacked his hand on the table.
"That's right. I left it on my dresser. Give me a minute to fetch it."
Walter took another sip of his whiskey and then stood up.
"Oh, did you watch the video on audiobooks? I want you to show me how to set my phone up to listen to books for my walks when you're not around."
"Watched it. I think I got it." As Walter disappeared, Brad thought about the questions they'd stopped talking about. Why couldn't Brad always manifest his physical self? And where did he go when he wasn't here? The unanswered questions were less troubling than they'd once been because he continued to reappear. He popped back into place. But answers would be nice. Maybe Mary Margaret, the psychic nun, would have some answers. Chapter 4. Gramps, she's not a nun and a psychic, just a psychic. Where do you get this stuff? Wait, don't tell me. Brad. Hillary shifted the phone to her other ear and rinsed the dish she'd been washing.
"I didn't say it, you did. So will you call your not a nun, just a psychic friend and have her come over?"
Her grandfather seemed convinced this time would be different, and she hated to disappoint him. But it wouldn't be different, because there was no Brad. I'll talk to her, but I don't think...
"You're an angel, Peanut. Dinner the day after tomorrow?"
Wouldn't miss it. Hillary viciously scrubbed a particularly resistant bit of food, then blinked when she realized she'd not only been scrubbing a clean dish for several seconds, she'd also forgotten to put her gloves on.
"Great. I'll tell you about this new thing I found, audiobooks. I can walk and listen to a book at the same time, all on my new phone. I'm still trying to decide on the earbuds or the over-ear headphones. I think over-ear. Better sound quality."
Hillary grinned, her concerns about Brad shelved for the moment. Her grandfather came up with some new gadget about once every 2 or 3 months, and he never asked her advice. Imaginary Brad, her tush. Gramps had a geeky, gadgety side that had only surfaced after her grandmother had passed. That sounds really cool, Gramps. I'll see you day after tomorrow.
Call your psychic, don't forget.
Yes, sir. After she ended the call, her hand hovered over the contacts icon. After a few seconds, she put the phone down. She said she'd call, but she didn't say she'd call immediately. Once she was done with the dishes that had accumulated throughout the day, with her dish gloves on, she got ready for bed. Tonight was definitely TV catch-up night. She needed a little escapism about now. She might even have an unwatched episode of The Bachelor recorded. Just as she was about to get into bed, her phone chirped with the text from Beth. Have you tried on the glasses? Oops! Hillary booked it out to her car barefooted, grabbing her keys on the way out. She'd completely forgotten about them. She'd been so distracted, and then she'd eaten dinner with Gramps, and when she got back in the car, she hadn't seen them, so the glasses had slipped from her mind entirely. Nothing on the seat. She opened the passenger side door and ran her hand along the floor. A few fraught seconds later, her fingers touched the bedazzled frames. Thank goodness. She'd almost lost what were probably magic glasses. Magic glasses. Almost lost. Who did that? And even if she was annoyed with the implications, again magic, she had to admit they were fabulous. She couldn't let them sit at the bottom of her Fiat, all alone and sad. She clutched the glasses against her chest and hurried back into the house before one of her neighbors mistook her for a car thief. A hot, scantily clad car thief, yes. But, rocking bot or not, in her neighborhood, the cops would be called. Her heart thumped loudly as she closed the side door to her house. She leaned back against the door, waiting for her heart to stop racing. And then she laughed. They probably weren't anything special. Sparkly fab, yes, but otherwise just a little pair of glasses. Walking to her bedroom, she ran her finger along the frames. The cool, bumpy stones felt just like the crystals they were. She plopped down on her bed and grabbed her phone off the nightstand. She quickly typed, "Nope, but I think I might." Her phone rang immediately. Hillary tapped the ignore button. The glasses lay innocently in her lap, the gaudy yet gorgeous crystals catching the bedside light and flashing. "Why not?" she whispered. What were the chances something would actually happen? She was the believer, Beth the skeptic, and yet it was Beth who'd traveled back in time. So, the way Hillary saw it, it would either do nothing and she could stop worrying over the silly things, or she'd get a grand adventure in the 50s. After all, it wasn't like Beth had been trapped in Victorian England. And Glenda didn't have any reason to banish Hillary, a frequent and well-funded customer, to another era. The thought of her grandpa made her hesitate, but it was almost as if she couldn't say no to the glasses. It boiled down to a simple equation. She wanted to. The risk seemed small. Why not? Hillary tipped her head. At least the 50s had demonstrated a sense of style she could appreciate. And she looked like $1,000,000 in a fitted bodice with an A-line swing skirt. That's right, she would rock the 50s. She picked up the glasses and perched them carefully on her nose. And waited. Then she flipped the chain around her neck. And waited. The weight of the glasses pressed down on the bridge of her nose. The sturdy frame, the crystals, and the glass combined to make the weight noticeable. Hillary looked at her hands, then did a double-take. Was that an age spot? She inspected the blemish more carefully. Maybe a freckle. Hillary pursed her lips. Shouldn't she feel different? Well, she'd had them on for at least a minute or two. If that wasn't long enough, maybe the glorious Glenda needed to polish up on her magic. If she remembered the next step correctly, she should go to sleep and dream sweet 50s dreams. Although Hillary suspected her dreams might be closer to R than the PG stuff Beth had reported. Not surprisingly, as soon as she laid her head on the pillow, Hillary's mind started to churn. How did one enchant glasses? How is time travel possible? Why Beth? If the glasses worked, why her? What would it smell like in the 50s? Would she just appear out of thin air? If she did, would she be in some hidden place so as not to frighten the natives? Would she arrive attired in movie star glamour? Or, horrors, be made up like a housewife? What about... Bright light pierced Hillary's lids. This was it. This was time travel. She opened her eyes and squinted at the harsh light. The light streaming through her bedroom window. She'd forgotten to draw the curtains last night. Seriously, Glenda? Hillary rolled out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom. A little water splashed on her face woke her up enough to text Beth. Tried the glasses. Epic fizzle. Her phone didn't ring immediately, so Beth was likely still asleep. Just as well. Hillary hadn't decided how she felt about it yet. Except the peeved part. Not much doubt in her mind on that count. She was definitely peeved that Glenda was a hope-raising evil bat and liked to mess about in innocent people's lives. Hillary pursed her lips. Innocent might be a stretch. Harmless? She smirked. No one would accuse her of that. Unsuspecting. That might work. The glitter of the glasses caught her eye. Oh, you lovely darlings. Away you go. She shoved them in her nightstand. After some breakfast and an immodest dose of caffeine, Hillary recognized that there was a smallish, or possibly not so small, chance that she was being an ungrateful cow. The glasses had been a gift. One should be appreciative of gifts. But then her newfound regret gave way to a twitchy uneasiness. The gift had actually been an odd one, given out of the blue and for no apparent reason. Sure, she'd eyed them, but she hadn't even voiced a compliment. Had she? And why had she accepted them? In accepting them, why hadn't she questioned the reason for the gift? And oddest of all, why had she tried them on? Disappearing into the pale-complected, red-lipped flawlessness of 1950s makeup might seem like a treat, but even the slightest risk she might not return, that she would leave her grandpa alone, was simply not worth it. I smell something rotten. Before she could assess her actions, she was standing next to her bed, her nightstand drawer open. The morning sun glinted off the crystal embellishments on the glasses, catching her eye. Looking at the glasses, resting innocuously enough inside the drawer, Hilary felt a tug to try them on again. And what was with all the glinting? Were the crystals even catching the sunlight, or did the damn things just flash, sparkling temptation whenever she looked in their direction? Oh, no, you didn't. The glasses shined temptingly, with no direct sunlight in the vicinity. You sneaky, underhanded witch! Hilary grabbed her phone, and her fingers flew as she typed a text to Beth. I've been poison-appled. Her phone rang immediately. You've been what? Beth didn't even bother with hello. I'm the recipient of a Trojan horse, a poisoned apple. Hilary tried not to fume, but she failed, utterly, completely, and eventually without regret. She unclenched her jaw and continued. That's right. Our good witch is an imposter, totally evil. The glasses were a tainted gift. That evil witch enchanted the glasses, I'm sure of it. You're upset about missing out on the 50s? Beth said in a small voice. No, this has nothing to do with time travel. It has everything to do with my unreasonable and persistent desire to put those darn glasses on. Even now, Hilary felt her eyes drift, drawn to the sparkle and shine. She closed the nightstand drawer. I don't get it. Why make you want to wear them if they don't do anything? Beth's voice firmed and a suspicious note crept in. Are you sure this isn't your normal fashion obsession kicking in? You do love a good accessory. That's true. I do. Just before the words left her lips, Hilary felt that same little push. You have got to be kidding me. I'm grabbing at any excuse for them not to be cursed against reason. I'm sure now there's something wrong with these glasses. Until I figure out how they've been jinxed, they're not coming out of the drawer. Okay, if that makes you feel better. Really? You, the lady soon to be engaged to a time-traveling wonder, are doubting the existence of cursed glasses? Beth sighed. Good point. You know, I drank a lot of wine yesterday. I'm not quite up to par today. Uh-huh. Go drink some coffee. I have no sympathy for you. I'm the one with the creepy glasses that are calling my name. Right. I guess call me if anything, weird or potentially hazardous happens. Hilary looked at her phone and had a pang of sympathy for her grandpa. Even at the end of that conversation, she could sense Beth's hesitation. Her best friend didn't buy that there was something going on with those glasses. It was frustrating because Hilary was so sure. She felt it. All right, Gramps, you win. Hilary dialed Mary Margaret. Having a taste of what her grandpa had been suffering with this whole Brad situation made her more sympathetic. Seriously, she could feel the tug of those glasses, and even the one person on the planet most likely to believe her had been skeptical. Mary Margaret answered with a cheerful greeting. It's Hilary, and I've got a huge favor to ask. Well, the last time you had an emergency, I met your time-traveling friend, so sure. Hilary could hear the smile in Mary Margaret's voice. Mary Margaret was solid, grounded, practical, happy with where she was in life. Just being around her made Hilary feel more relaxed. Gramps would love her. Here's the thing. Gramps didn't have much faith in the last psychic I had come to the house, so he's asked me to get you to come around. Any chance you can put aside your ethics for an afternoon and visit my grandpa? Oh, you know I don't do ghosts. I know. He and Brad, his invisible buddy, have discussed it and have decided you're bound to be much better than Madame Celeste, even though you're not an expert in ghosts. I swear, I told him you don't usually do dead people. Gramps says Brad doesn't understand why he wouldn't have an aura, and I should ask you anyway. Ah, he doesn't have an aura because he's not alive, assuming he exists. I've tried to explain that, but Gramps keeps insisting. Also, I'm having a bad day, and if you could do this, my karmic points would triple, roughly. Right. Does that mean you're picking up the bill? Yes, please, and thank you. Hilary raided the freezer for her last stash of donuts. She'd earned one. When do you think you might swing by? I'll squeeze him in during my lunch if that works with his schedule, Mary Margaret said. I'm actually rather keen to meet your grandfather. You talk about him a lot. He's a big part of my life. But you don't need to see him today. It's not an emergency, and Brad's definitely not going anywhere. Hillary had visions of comforting her grandpa after another failed effort to contact Brad. Those empathetic tugs of understanding she'd experienced only went so far. She felt for her grandpa that no one believed him, but that didn't change the fact that Brad didn't exist. She popped another donut to the toaster oven. She deserved two. Today was going to be rough. Then Hillary remembered Gramps' appointment with the shrink. Actually, today would be great. I've got a client appointment, but I'll check with him to see if he's available. It's probably better I'm not there. You can be vague and promise to send a report. Then I can break the news later. Oh my, Mary Margaret sighed. Okay, I suppose that's as good a way to handle it as any other. Thank you, Mary Margaret. As soon as she hung up, Hillary grabbed a third donut. If ever there was a 3-donut day, this was it. Chapter 5. Hillary's phone rang just as she was finishing up with her lunch client, a successful businesswoman who didn't have the time or patience to keep up with styles or find outfits that fit and flattered her particular body type. Getting paid to shop, Hillary sighed. She did love her job. She tapped the ignore button and quickly wrapped up the session. Before she could get back to her car, her phone rang again. She checked the caller ID. 2 missed calls from Mary Margaret, and now a third call. She answered the phone as she got into her car. What's happened? Did Gramps freak out? Is he okay? Mary Margaret's voice came across thin and reedy. Your grandfather is fine. I, however, am not. Can you come right now? Hillary paused in the act of stowing her purse. What's happened? I'm not sure. Maybe, No, never mind. I'm driving quick as I can. See you in 10. Hillary hung up the phone, shoved her purse onto the floorboards, and then did her best to break every speed limit as safely as possible. Unflappable Mary Margaret stumbling over her words, possibly in shock? Not good. By the time she arrived at her grandpa's house, her heart was thudding erratically. She'd imagined several horrifying scenarios, all extremely unlikely because they involved Gramps sick or injured, and that Mary Margaret would have told her immediately. She slammed her car door and raced up the walkway as fast as her 2-inch heels allowed. Slow down, Hillary. Everything's fine. Gramps looked tickled pink. I gave your friend a whiskey, and she's doing much better now. Seeing her grandpa looking so cheery put her irrational fears to rest, but that brought up a different slew of potential problems. Eyes narrowed and hands on her hips, Hillary asked, What did you do to her, Gramps? She's a nice woman. She's a peach and good at her job. Gramps beamed. This one's a keeper, Peanut. She can see Brad. Hillary grabbed her grandpa by the arm and pulled him the rest of the way up the walk, her heels making a satisfying click as she approached the house. Hey, now, don't get yourself in a state. I'm coming. Too late. I'm already in a state. You broke my psychic. Of course I'm upset. Hillary followed her grandpa, who'd taken the lead to open the back door, into the kitchen. Mary Margaret looked a little pale, but otherwise fine. She'd recovered enough to be busy texting on her phone, so that was a good sign. Since Mary Margaret was otherwise occupied, Hillary addressed the hot guy sitting on the other side of the table. I'm sorry, who are you? And why are you here? Ha! Gramps cackled. I knew it. The strange man's jaw dropped. You can see me? He sat up straighter. You can see me. Hillary covered her face with her hands and rubbed her eyes, ignoring the fact that she was likely smearing eyeliner and mascara. When she lowered her hands, he was still there, standing now and pointing at her. She can see me. He looked at Gramps with a ridiculously large grin spreading across his face and repeated the statement with even greater conviction and perhaps a tinge of hysteria. She can see me. Brad, I presume? Hillary sank into the chair next to Mary Margaret, who by now had stopped texting. I've canceled the rest of my appointments for the afternoon. Mary Margaret pushed her whiskey glass toward Hillary. Fabulous, Hillary said, and then she downed the rest of the whiskey. Chapter 6. Brad didn't understand why everyone in the room wasn't jumping up and down in delirious joy. Mary Margaret could miraculously see ghosts, a bonus talent for her. And Hillary should be thrilled she finally had evidence Walter wasn't cracked. Brad knew how much she loved the old guy. He waited for the whiskey to take effect, hoping it would soften the sharp edges of her features. As he waited and watched, Walter sat down at the table. Walter rubbed his whiskery chin.
Haven't had this many visitors in a long time.
Hillary motioned for the whiskey bottle. Walter raised an eyebrow but pushed the bottle toward her. Don't worry, I'm not driving. She poured a few fingers into the glass. Your fault, so you're giving me a ride home.
How am I responsible? I've always been honest about Brad.
Walter sniffed.
Well, after the first few months, I wasn't so sure myself in the beginning. Anyone else wondering why I'm suddenly visible? Hey,
Brad nudged Walter.
Ask the expert.
Walter looked at Mary Margaret and said,
He wants to know why Hillary can suddenly see him.
Hillary's head bobbed between Brad and Mary Margaret. I thought, Mary Margaret, if you can't see him...
Or hear,
Brad said. Hillary glared in his direction, then turned back to Mary Margaret. If you can't see or hear him, how do you know he's there? Sweetheart, why do you think I'm so baffled? I can see his aura. Mary Margaret traced an outline of Brad's form in the air. All the while, the lines in her forehead deepened and her look became more intent. An impetuous nature, a generous soul, guilt. Her finger stopped. I shouldn't be able to see a dead man's aura. She turned an apologetic look toward Brad. I'm sorry, I usually ask first.
Tell her it's okay.
Brad leaned his forearms on the table. He'd learned something. His guilt was a visible thing. Now, if he could figure out why he felt guilty, that would be a significant piece of information. He says it's fine, but he brings up a good question. Why now? Then Hillary squeezed her eyes shut. The poisoned apple. When she opened them, every eye was trained on her. I think a witch did this. She gave me some reading glasses, but I think they were whammied. I put them on, even though I knew I shouldn't. It sounds wackadoo, even to me, but the glasses made me do it. Granted, I had no idea the result would be that. Hillary flung her hand in Brad's direction. I thought I might make a quick trip to the 50s, see the wonders, admire some biceps, kiss a boy, and all the while carrying off flawless makeup and a swing skirt.
You know a witch? Brad asked. Then he turned to Walter and said, How did we not know this?
I don't tell Gramps everything. Hillary had the grace to look at least a little sheepish. Sorry, Gramps. She asked Mary Margaret. Did I miss the aura conversation? If Brad's dead, how does he have an aura? Mary Margaret cleared her throat. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Dead people don't have auras, not in my experience. And if he's not dead... Mary Margaret shrugged helplessly. Brad couldn't believe what he was hearing. Maybe he wasn't dead. That's inconvenient. If he's not a ghost, what is he? How does a live person become invisible? Or whatever he is. Hillary turned intense eyes on Brad and looked him up and down. And why? Why you? Brad lifted his hands.
Hey, the expert says I'm a decent guy, that I have a generous soul. This isn't my fault. I don't think it's my fault.
Before he could explain further, Walter stepped in.
Brad isn't his real name. When we met, he didn't have any memory of who he was. He'd been living in an empty house a few doors down, but then they tore it down.
That's when I met Walter and eventually moved in, Brad said. Walter patted him on the arm.
Let me tell it, son, so Mary Margaret gets it the first time around.
Fair enough. Not like Walter didn't know the details just as well as he did himself.
So I'm looking less than my best, wearing a robe 24/7, needing a haircut, and this guy...
Walter hitches a thumb in Brad's direction.
He sees me fetching my mail one day. He's standing in my yard and I say, get lost, or something similar. And after that I couldn't shake him. I was the first person who'd spoken to him in months since he died, we thought. But now, who knows?
Mary Margaret turned to Hillary and said, What about Glenda? Poisoned apple, or magicked glasses rather, aside, can we ask her for help? This is so far outside of my experience, and she's clearly involved. And Glenda hasn't acted malevolently in the past. If the glasses let you see Brad and that's all they do, that's a good outcome. Besides, if I don't know what he is, where do I even start?
Human, male, all-around nice guy, and definitely listening to you talk about me, Brad said.
Hillary pinched her lips together. He thought maybe to hide a smile, then said, "You know exactly what she means. Are you undead or half dead or, I don't know, cursed?" A nasty chill crawled up his back.
How would I know if I was cursed?
Walter repeated the question for Mary Margaret. Her eyes got big. "I don't do curses. I don't do anything that alters someone's reality. I just read what's there already." "Altering reality, yes, that's the glorious Glenda." Hillary let out a frustrated groan. "Except Glenda is AWOL. No cell and no other way to contact her. That woman has the worst timing possible, or a vicious sense of humor. I have a small network, mostly online, of people I trust. They all have some connection to the supernatural. I can start by asking if anyone else has experience with someone who's dead but not dead." Mary Margaret nodded in Brad's direction. "Apologies, until we find a word for what you are." Brad shrugged.
He says that's fine. Is anyone else wondering at the timing of all this? The very suspicious and perhaps auspicious timing of Brad's discovery? Walter asked. Remember, Peanut, my appointment with the shrink doctor lady?
Hillary's head slowly fell forward until her forehead touched the kitchen table, and then she started to bang her head, not too hard, on the wooden surface.
Should you maybe stop her? Brad asked Walter,
but Walter just shook his head. Finally, she stopped, but her head remained firmly planted on the table. "How am I related to those terrible people? And why is Glenda jacking around with our lives at such a sensitive time?"
"They're not terrible, just confused and concerned," Walter said.
A grumbly mumble emerged from under the thick, dark curls that had fallen to cover her face.
"What was that?"
Brad asked. Hillary lifted her head up off the table. A red mark marred the skin on her forehead. "I said they're greedy." She rubbed her eyes, lightly smearing her mascara. "Okay, here's what we do." She pointed at Brad. "You're dead, or not quite dead, so we find out exactly what's going on with you and how to fix you. If your Gramps is living in the flesh border, he's not crazy." She turned to Mary Margaret. "Your job is to milk your network for clues as to whatever Brad might be. Find out if he's fixable. Or if not, what we do with him."
"Whoa."
Brad did not like the sound of that. She pointed that finger at him again. "You hush! My grandpa might lose his house and end up in an assisted living facility because of you. We'll try to help you, but if we can't, well, Gramps' unfortunate public image is basically all your fault. And if you're such a good buddy of his, you already know he can't lie to save his life. So you're flesh or you're gone." She shook her head when he opened his mouth to speak and pointed a finger at him. "Period. Not another word. I'm going to do some research on your origins, which means I need a list of every detail available related to local knowledge, personal history, and the timeline of events. Gramps, you can help him. Or, actually write it out." Walter didn't look at all pleased by the pronouncement, but he kept his mouth shut. Brad figured he'd hear all about what Walter was thinking later. Probably over a whiskey after Hillary was home safe. Mary Margaret stood up. "I'll get started right away. And Brad, I'm sorry about your situation. We'll do whatever we can to help you." He liked that one and decided that he and Walter had been spot on with Psychic Nun. Hillary, on the other hand, was a much more complicated equation. Chapter 7. Scenery flew by as Hillary stared out the passenger window. She should feel bad. She knew exactly how poorly her grandpa had been after her grandmother died. That robe alone should have been a criminal offense. But she hadn't been able to budge him. Not on the question of the robe, or leaving the house, or even spending a little time with her after school. She'd been young at the time and still in undergrad. But that wasn't any kind of excuse for her utter failure. It had taken the appearance of Brad to get Gramps back on track. She'd always known that. She just hadn't realized that Brad wasn't a construct created by her grandpa. She'd always envisioned Brad as a kind of bootstrapping mechanism, a way for her grandpa to yank himself out of the grim humor he'd sunken into. Nope, No bootstrapping involved, just a ghostly, not dead guy who apparently had an appallingly kind heart. Appalling because he made her choices now even more difficult. The situation was dire, the stakes too high. And as much help as Brad had been at one time, he'd turned into a massive liability. She had one palatable option: fix Brad. She hoped that worked. Because of the remaining two options, either make her grandpa an exceptional liar or make Brad disappear, she suspected the second would be much easier. Complicated questions, complicated answers. She couldn't be more annoyed with either Glenda or Brad. And it would only get worse if the psych eval her grandpa had coming up went poorly. She frowned as the scenery flew by. "You drive too fast." Gramps laughed.
I don't. I drive the same speed as everyone else."
Silence fell again. They'd almost arrived home before her grandpa spoke again.
"You're not being fair. To Brad, I mean. It's one thing if you could make him whole again, but to make him move to the afterlife when he's not ready, that's not right."
Her throat burned. Bile? Tears? How about guilt? Could guilt choke a person? She tried to swallow, but couldn't. "I know. We'll try our best, but you know what's going to happen. Carol and Tim won't see reason, not when one keeps cheering the other on. They're like a starving dog with a meaty bone. How did such a nice man have such annoying children?"
"That's not fair either. They're worried."
After a brief pause, he added,
"And they're good kids."
That hesitation spoke volumes. But he'd never admit his children were anything less than his idealized versions of them. Gramps was a really, really good guy. "Are they worried, Gramps? Are they really? How often do they come to check on you? How much time do they spend with you?" Hillary bit her lip. They were his kids. "They may have started out concerned, but now all they can see is how much easier everyone's lives would be if you sold that house."
"You know how busy they both are. Carol and her husband have demanding jobs. Tim has only been married 6 months. He and Suzanne haven't even unpacked all the boxes in their new house yet. Carol and Tim have their own lives and their own families. And Peanut, it is just a house."
Hillary pulled her gaze away from the passing scenario and forced herself to look at her grandpa. "Is that all it is to you? Because if that's true, we can sell it quickly and set you up in a place that you choose." She carefully avoided the more obvious question. How was it that she could make time and they couldn't? She had a demanding job, though more flexible than Carol and her husband's corporate jobs, and an active dating life, though less active recently.
"If it comes to selling, I'd rather decide where to live than have the choice taken away. Of course I would. But for now, I'm staying."
He fell silent, and when he did eventually speak, his tone had changed.
"Almost all of my memories of your grandmother are tied together with that house. But I don't want to stay at the expense of my friend's life."
She understood. She didn't agree, but she certainly understood. A few more miles passed by, and then a suspicious thought popped into Hillary's head. "All the fun tech stuff you buy?"
"Oh, well, that's Brad. He likes gadgets. He has a limited ability to touch solid objects, so I do most of the button pushing and such. But he watches the how-to videos and reads the manuals."
Hillary snorted. "Of course he does."
"He's a good man, Peanut."
Hillary had heard so many stories about Brad over the years. She'd felt like she knew him. But he'd been her Gramps' imaginary friend, and she'd always thought of him as a reflection of the best parts of her grandpa, not an actual person. Weird to think of him in terms of short dark hair, well-defined arms, and charming dimple. Yep, super weird. She sighed. "I know he is. We'll do our best for him, I promise." But Gramps was her priority. The scrawled list took up about a page. It was full of miscellaneous bits and pieces of information. At first, nothing jumped out at Hillary. But maybe... She scanned the list for the umpteenth time. Just maybe Brad's knowledge of a local high school's mascot meant he attended the high school here. Hopefully, Brad and Gramps would brainstorm a little more successfully when they weren't under so much pressure. She'd been whiskied up and ready to go home when they'd drafted this list earlier. She sat down at her computer and started to sift through the sparse facts on the sheet. 2 hours later, after trawling through so many internet sites her click finger had started to ache, Hillary thought she'd found something. She scrolled through the article one more time. Search for Stephen Bradley Sherwood, 25-year-old missing man, suspended. The authorities called off the search after 3 days when they discovered the date of his disappearance was the first anniversary of his girlfriend's death in a tragic car accident. Suicide was suspected, but no body was found. The article didn't contain a picture and only a few additional details. He'd gone missing from his mother's home in Austin, but he had been living in Minnesota for several months prior to his death. Hillary double-checked the date of the article. 2009. 7 years ago and a few months before Walter ran into Brad lurking on his lawn. The right age, the right time frame. The name? That was weird, since he said he couldn't remember his name. She'd have to ask Walter how they'd landed on Brad. It wasn't much, but Stephen Sherwood was the closest she'd come to even a remote fit of available facts. She needed a picture. A photo would definitively prove or disprove Sherwood as Brad's real identity. A picture of Stephen Sherwood just became her priority number 1. A twinge in her back itched toward more of an ache. Maybe priority number 2. She stood up and did a series of stretches. Before she could sit down, her stomach reminded her she'd had too much booze and not enough food. By the time she'd fed herself and settled back in front of her computer, she had an instant message from Mary Margaret. Confirmation from 3 different people that an aura means alive in some sense of the word. Hillary sent a video chat invite and Mary Margaret popped up on her screen. Hey, what else did you find? Mary Margaret tucked a few strands of silver hair behind her ear. A general consensus that if you've got an aura, you're alive. But apparently the undead also have an aura, a very distinctive one. Please tell me Brad isn't among the undead. I'm not even sure what undead means, but it sounds almost as permanent as dead. Hillary tipped her laptop screen back so she could lean back in her chair and not disappear. The undead angle is highly unlikely. One of my contacts has seen the aura of an undead. She said it was unmistakably different, and I couldn't miss it. So, according to your people, Brad's neither dead nor undead, which leaves... Mary Margaret frowned. Alive, but invisible? No, he's physically less substantial. It's like his edges are fuzzy. I should have poked him when I had the chance. Since I didn't, I'd guess he was kind of like a ghost, but a little firmer. He can touch things and people, I'm sure. I saw him touch Gramps on the arm. Something niggled at Hillary's memory. Oh, Gramps said buttons, remote controls, the mouse for a computer were hard for him, so maybe he can't move things? I don't know. The point is he's not just invisible. We're stumped. My network isn't really set up for this kind of support, though. We talk more about how to best help our clients than anything else. How to help families with grief, break bad news, that kind of thing. A few of us have happened upon unusual events or people in the course of our work, but that's the extent of our knowledge. Mary Margaret frowned, then said, Have you considered an expert? Someone like a paranormal investigator? No. After Madame Celeste, I've become more discriminating. Not only did she fail to spot Brad and tell me my cheating ex was the one, she gave me fashion advice. Bad fashion advice. I'm leery of hiring anyone in the business without a recommendation now. Maybe you could ask your friends for a referral? I'll see if my network has a recommendation. Even if they're not local, a good investigator should be able to make a local referral, right? Maybe. I hope so, because our resident evil witch appears and disappears on her own schedule. Speaking of the evil queen, I might have a look at those glasses again, with gloves and tongs, just in case there's a clue I missed. Hillary copied the article link she'd found earlier and pasted it into a message to Mary Margaret. Check this out. I'm looking for a picture to confirm or deny if this is our guy. After scanning the article, Mary Margaret said, Well, if it is him, he has a mother who never had the chance to properly bury her son. Not knowing has to be torture for her. Hillary ended the chat on that depressing note and decided she'd deal with what to tell Brad's family when, or even if, that opportunity arose. She had enough problems. She didn't need to borrow any more worry. And right now her eyes and her back needed a break. She rolled her chair away from her computer desk. What did you find? a vaguely familiar male voice asked. "Ah!" Hillary fell in a tumble of arms and legs at the foot of her desk. "Ow, ow, 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 ow!" Her funny bone throbbed and tears pricked at her eyes. Brad stood about 10 feet away, looking apologetic. "I tried to knock," he demonstrated by rapping his knuckles against the wall. While his hand appeared to make contact, no sound resulted. "How are you even here? Aren't you tethered to the house?" Hillary eyed him suspiciously while she rubbed her elbow. Then she remembered. He wasn't a ghost, and he'd wandered up onto her grandpa's lawn. "Never mind." "No, that's actually an interesting question." "Let me stop you there. Just give me a minute, okay?" Annoyance colored her words, and she felt a little bad about it. It wasn't his fault she was klutzy, or that the chair rolled out from under her, or, and this was the big one, that she felt terrible about possibly exorcising him into the ether. Wounded dignity abandoned, she scrambled up on her hands and knees and then stood up. After checking that all of her moving parts still worked, she said, "Why don't you have a seat and we can talk about what we've found so far?" He looked at the closest spare chair several feet away. "Maybe you could, you know." "Ah, sorry." She scooted the chair closer to her computer, then dropped back down into her computer chair. "Do you get tired?" "Not like before. I fade away, and when I've recharged, I come back. Scared the heck out of Walter the first few times it happened." "But you don't need to sleep or rest in the normal sense?" "No, I walked here. It took a while, but I'm not tired. It is nice to sit down, though." Hillary stared at him. "Weird." "Thanks, I'm aware." He dropped down into the seat next to her, leaning forward and looking at the computer. "Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. It's just weird. I get it." Brad turned to her, his face serious and his eyes intent. "I know you're doing your best for Walter, and I'm completely on board with anything that keeps him in his house and happy. He's my best friend. Of course, I want that. But I'd like to keep up to date with everything you find. This is also my life, or my afterlife, we're talking about." "You don't trust me." "Should I?" The question wasn't snide. He was seriously asking her if he could trust her not to send him to oblivion. She bit her lip. "Probably not. I'm sorry. Gramps will come first every time." "Just consider that it may not have to be one or the other." He looked back at the screen, leaving her to stare at a well-defined jawline and a once-broken nose. Brad was hot. She'd thought it when she'd first seen him in her grandpa's kitchen, but in all the drama of ghosts and such, she'd sort of forgotten. Great. No one was a bigger pushover for a hot guy. She shoved her hair behind her ears and turned back to the computer screen. "Right. What do you think about the name Stephen Bradley Sherwood?" As soon as the name left her lips, all hell broke loose. Chapter 8. Stephen Bradley brought a chill down his spine, but then Hillary said Sherwood and his guts started to burn. He'd never felt pain, not in his insubstantial ghost-like form. The chill happened occasionally, he suspected when a remnant of his old life triggered a sense of recognition. But pain? He'd never felt pain. "Oh no. No, you don't look so good." Hillary had gone pale. "Don't feel great." "You're all covered in black spots, like holes. And what's with the wind?" Her long dark hair wrapped around her face. "Are you okay?" But she already knew the answer. She looked and sounded terrified. His gut wrenched again, burning like cold fire and spreading. He felt like someone was turning him inside out. And then it stopped. No wind, no pain, no Hillary. In fact, he was in a completely different place. A shop? Oh, good. Nice to see you still in one piece. A woman with flyaway blonde hair bundled up atop her head stood to his right, inspecting him. "Where am I? And who are you? How can you see me?" "I was little Grace's godmother." A soft smile tipped up the corners of her mouth, wistful and sad. She held a hand out, and her tone turned brisk. "You can call me Glenda." "Grace?" He shook his head, but the familiar chill crawled up his spine. Belatedly, he accepted her hand. "Nice to meet you." The polite words escaped without thought. Your girlfriend, killed in a terrible accident, not your fault. She tipped her head as if reconsidering her words. Not any more so than any other young and inexperienced driver.
Are you saying I killed my girlfriend?
Brad wasn't sure he wanted to remember his former life if she was implying he'd been at fault. Glenda frowned. Pay attention. I said an accident, an awful, tragic accident, and we all miss Grace terribly.
But if you're Grace's godmother, did you do this to me?
No, not me. I hold no ill will toward you. Listen, boy, there isn't much time. You've been cursed. Curses are petty, small magics, excessive dandruff, pimples, a burning sensation in the nether regions, typically quickly worked and then later easily broken. But this curse is so much more. A full year in the making and fueled by the anger and grief of a bereaved parent. And now to find a memory charm with a killing curse attached. I never suspected such deviousness, even more powerful than I'd realized, with more layers. Glenda's hand sliced through the air. Calm yourself, I've diffused the killing curse you triggered. Brad closed his gaping mouth, but he continued to stare at her in confusion. That he'd triggered? I really don't understand. Glenda removed her reading glasses and gave him a look of pure exasperation. It's a simple equation. You've been cursed. Grace was a witch. Her mother is a witch. She cursed you. You must break the curse yourself. I would break it, but the spiteful... She composed herself. A terribly grief-stricken woman who is in a great deal of pain has made that impossible. Her eyes drifted to a point beyond Brad's shoulder. Why, she won't see reason even after all of these years. Glenda pressed her lips together tightly.
What do I do?
Glenda's gaze sharpened and returned to Brad. Speaking quickly, she said, Listen carefully. You must break what remains of the curse yourself. You must forgive. But Brad missed whatever he must do, because he disappeared to that quiet place that had no name, the place where he recharged. When he awoke from his forced slumber, he found himself in Hilary's home again. He usually returned at ever-changing intervals to the same location he'd been pulled from. So he wasn't certain why he'd landed here and not Glenda's shop, but he was glad. He had more questions for the witch, but he had the feeling that the time she'd given him had been on the sly, stolen somehow, and returning would be dangerous to them both. Standing in Hilary's living room, he couldn't help but be reminded of that moment when he'd been yanked by his guts, when his whole body felt like it was being turned inside out. Time had passed for everyone else in the world, but for him that had been mere minutes ago. Instead of dying, if he'd understood Glenda correctly, the intended result, he landed alive, though still cursed, in an antique shop. But he'd shaken Glenda's hand. Brad looked down at his cursed hand, no more substantial than he remembered. He had shaken her hand. He remembered that her grasp had been firm, but not tight, her skin smooth, warm, and dry. Substantial, real. How was that possible? He looked around for some sign of the date and time. He usually reappeared in less than 12 hours, but every once in a while it was longer. It was disorienting at the best of times, and now, with so much at stake, it frustrated him like never before. He spotted Hilary's laptop still on the table and turned on, but in sleep mode. Something had happened to him earlier. He had been able to touch. Maybe he still could. The laptop sat invitingly on Hilary's desk, tempting him to try. Carefully, he reached out and swiped the touchpad. Nothing. He tried again. The screen stayed stubbornly blank. He sat down in her chair and swiped his whole hand across the pad. The screen jumped to life. No different than his usual attempts to interact with objects. He seemed to lack substance, but still be able to impact the physical world around him on a very limited basis. Then why had Glenda's hand felt so real, so substantial in his own? The conundrum of his changing physicality kept him distracted for several seconds before he finally noticed the date. 3 days. He'd been gone 3 days. So long. Walter would be worried sick. And it was the middle of the night, so everyone was asleep. He had 2 choices, Hilary or Walter. Hilary was here. Walter was about an hour and a half by foot. Looked like he was staying at Hilary's. Interestingly enough, Brad found that while his body didn't tire, his mind placed limitations on him. His concentration would waver, though he wouldn't become physically tired. He'd been able to run an 8 or 9 minute mile before he'd become a ghost, No clue how he knew that, but he did. And about 8 minutes was what he could do now, except over much greater distances. It was a small piece of information, but one he should probably add to the list of miscellaneous Brad factoids that he and Walter had come up with. Brad poked around the notes on her desk as best he could. He found a few unrelated scribbles, and then he saw it. A name on a pad of paper. Stephen Bradley Sherwood. He flinched. But nothing happened. No burning pain. And he certainly didn't transport elsewhere. But there was no doubt this name, his name, had been the trigger for that unpleasant event. Glenda had called his amnesia a memory charm. So the real evil witch, not Glenda, even though Hilary took great pleasure in calling her one, had not intended him to live through the recovery of his memories. But Glenda had done something to make sure he'd lived. Thank goodness. He could only imagine how painful his death would have been if what he'd experienced in Hilary's living room had been a preview. He saw Hilary a split second before she spoke. Dressed in a tank and tiny shorts, she walked into the living room from the back of the house, probably her bedroom given her rumpled and makeupless state. "Hey." As dark as it was hard to gauge her reaction to his presence in her house. He had been found weirdly lurking yet again. He was starting to feel kind of pervy. "I was just looking at your notes." "We've been worried." She walked closer, and that's when he saw the red-rimmed eyes and gaunt face. Hilary always had a polish, whether she wore jeans and a tank, a sundress, or a flirty vintage frock with sexy heels. Now, fresh-faced and sleep-rumpled, she looked younger, vulnerable, and a little raw. Not how he'd have previously described Walter's sassy grandkid. The look didn't suit her. "You don't look so good." Brad's reflex response hung between them for a split second too long before she replied. He was an idiot. That's what happens after 7 years with only one man to talk to. The filter goes away. "Well, you look a heck of a lot better than the last time I saw you with all those holes and everything. What happened?" She walked over to the sofa and plopped down on it, extending her legs out onto the cushions. "You're not going to believe this, but I landed in some antique shop." Hilary closed her eyes and let her head drop back on the armrest. Her dark hair spilled down the sofa. The simple act of shaking Glenda's hand had reminded him what it felt like to touch another person. Suddenly he wanted to run his hands through that mass of dark curls. He wanted to touch the strands he suspected were silky and smooth. He wanted to touch a pretty girl's hair, or pick up a remote control, or type on a laptop. Anything, something, just to touch again. He'd given up on that hope long ago, but now that the desire had returned, it was an awful ache. "Hey, ghost boy, snap out of it." Brad looked up from his hands. "Yeah, sorry." He sat down on the armchair across from the sofa. The seating arrangement created a comfortable environment for conversation, and it made him wonder if Hilary had a lot of company. "Antique shop, right. So you say my name, I start to feel like someone is holding my voodoo doll self over an icy fire." Even in the dim light, he could see her disbelieving expression. "Hey, I didn't say it made any sense. And why the weird look when I mention voodoo? You're the one who's into psychics." "Just because I believe there might be ghosts doesn't mean I buy the zombie apocalypse is around the corner. And just because I believe in psychics and witches doesn't mean I believe in voodoo." "Fair enough, I suppose." Looking simultaneously impatient and sleepy, Hilary asked, "What happened next?" "Well, sticking with the voodoo doll analogy, like someone twisted the doll inside out. Then boom, I'm in some antique shop with a Glenda. I can only assume the Glenda." Hilary nodded. "Bet it was her vintage clothing store. It's just down the road." "No, antiques, I'm sure. The whole place was full of furniture. Maybe we're talking about a different Glenda? Blonde hair, pretty, nice, figure." "Filter, Brad, filter." "Sounds like our witch. What did she have to say for herself? Did she do this to you?"
"Wow, you do not like that lady. I thought she hooked your friends up, Beth and Edward."
Hilary rolled onto her side on the sofa. The moonlight that streamed through her windows highlighted the dark smudges under her eyes. "Yeah, she did. It's just her flaky, there and gone attitude. She sticks her nose in, and then she never seems to be around when you need her. Like we're some little side project that catches her attention every once in a while. And really, the seductive glasses begging to be worn? That is not okay."
I didn't get the impression her involvement was casual. She seemed pretty worked up about it all. Well, except the part where I live or die.
He thought back to their conversation.
She was actually pretty casual about my possible death.
I told you she's the evil witch of this story.
Well, evil or no, I am glad you put her glasses on.
He shrugged when she shot him a narrow-eyed look.
Hey, we wouldn't even be having this conversation otherwise. And I'm pretty sure Glenda saved my life when she yanked me out of here, so it's hard for me to judge her too harshly. Even though you're convinced she's Satan's offspring, she's not so bad. The woman who cursed me, maybe that's the one we should call the evil witch.
Hillary snorted and chuckled. I'm sorry, it's not funny, but really, curses? Good witches, bad witches, it's like a fairy tale come to life. And he'd forgotten.
Glenda was my girlfriend's godmother. My girlfriend, Grace, was supposed to have died in a car accident.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I think I found some information about you. Did Glenda confirm that you're this Stephen Bradley Sherwood?
No, but since the world imploded when I learned the name, I'm guessing yes. She did tell me that I'm cursed.
Hillary perked up. Cursed means that we can break it. Don't suppose she mentioned how to break the curse?
No. Wait, yes, something to do with forgiveness, but I was yanked out of the shop before she could say more. She told me Grace, my girlfriend, was killed in a car crash. I still don't remember that, and her mother had cursed me.
You were gone for 3 days. Hillary's eyes narrowed in consternation. There has to be more.
I was with Glenda for, I don't know, a few minutes, at most. She was trying to tell me, but she wasn't in control when I left.
That's worrying. Hillary let loose a huge yawn and her jaw cracked.
It's the middle of the night. Why are you even up?
You disappear from my living room filled with holes like something's eating you? I don't know, maybe I haven't been sleeping so great these last few days. She sounded annoyed, but he thought she might be uncomfortable letting him know she'd been worried. Or she was cranky as heck from lack of sleep. Either way, pointing out her apparent concern for him didn't seem particularly clever. But maybe that boded well for her not exorcising him into oblivion.
Maybe you should get some more sleep. But can you call Walter when you get up and let him know I'm okay?
She rolled off the sofa and landed lightly on her feet. No need. He's crashing in my spare bedroom. When you didn't show after a day, he got pretty worried. He said you'd probably turn up here first. Her lips twisted. I think he was a little suspicious I did something to exorcise you. Like I'd do that on the sly. Anyway, we'll catch up in the morning. After coffee.
Yeah, in the morning.
He did his best not to stare as she walked away. She was Walter's grandkid. But those shorts were so tiny. After she left, he settled back into the same armchair. He had until morning to make sense of his unexpected and decidedly odd teleportation and to consider the new facts that Glenda had revealed. His girlfriend had died. He'd been driving. It was an accident, but he'd been driving. And Grace. Brad felt a stab of remorse. He still had no memory of Grace, a woman who'd died in a car he was driving. Not a woman, his girlfriend. He knew one person who had no reservations about his guilt. Grace's mother, the witch who'd cursed him. Chapter 9. Hillary wandered back to her bed in a state of combined relief and exhaustion. But a niggling concern arose as she climbed into bed. Maybe, if she had to make the choice, Hillary wouldn't be able to banish Brad into the ether. Hillary hoped it wouldn't come to that. 3 days believing that she'd accidentally sent him to the netherworld, because where else would he be going with that tortured look on his face, and she could barely look at herself in the mirror. She wasn't sleeping, which was giving her horrendous dark circles. Meals tasted terrible, which just made her sad. And worst of all, she caught Walter eyeing her suspiciously. He'd come to stay not long after Brad disappeared, which had been good for both of them. They'd both needed a little company. The weird thing? She kind of liked having him here. Their current status as temporary roommates had one good result. Hillary could envision living with her grandpa long term. She had no idea why it hadn't occurred to her before, or if he'd be up for it, but it was another option as their crazy family drama unfolded. Gramps' competency hearing wasn't for weeks, but his evaluation was scheduled in a few days. She rolled onto her side, trying to get more comfortable, and reviewed her efforts of the last few days. She'd read up on curses, both cursing and breaking curses, witchcraft, protection spells, and anything related to magic that looked like it might have a kernel of truth in it. And after 3 days, she had less than she'd started with. No facts, no solid information, and a real fear that the curse wasn't breakable. Oh, and some mildly annoyed clients who'd needed placating. Canceling appointments wasn't her norm, but she cultivated a certain type of client, the kind who didn't like changed plans. While Hilary had been digging around, Mary Margaret had pursued different lines of inquiry. She'd even found a referral for a local paranormal investigator, one who was off the grid. No advertising, no website, no social media. Clients by referral only. When Mary Margaret had described his setup and how he had a P.O. box where prospective clients sent their contact information and information about the job, and then he'd contact you if he was interested, well, she thought he'd sounded like an assassin. Or a corny wannabe detective. As Hilary tossed and turned in her bed, she decided that desperation might push her to call him, but it made her uncomfortable. Glenda was the key, not some shady guy who busted ghosts under the table for cash. Or if not Glenda, then Brad's past. What had Glenda meant about forgiveness? Forgive himself? That was hard to do with amnesia. Forgive Grace's mom for cursing him? Would that involve a confrontation? Bad idea, since Grace's mom was seriously pissed off and crazy powerful. See Exhibit A, the depth, breadth, and length of the curse. And the woman might be literally crazy, because what sane person cursed another person to a life of such loneliness? Hilary sat up in bed and then punched her pillow. Confronting the mom should not happen. She'd plopped back down on her bed. Now Glenda, the meddling absentee witch, there was someone she'd like to confront. Hilary had tried to contact her at the shop, and the sales clerk had been really nice, but that didn't change the fact that Glenda remained unreachable. Given Brad's description, Hilary thought she'd give it one more try tomorrow. Now she knew Glenda's end destination. Sort of. Surely the antique shop was another of Glenda's properties, and if it was, then she'd get that number from the sales clerk and she'd try that shop. Finally, with a firm plan of action in mind, Hilary turned over and fell into a restless, dreamless sleep. Chapter 10. Glenda addressed the mirror inside her vintage compact. "I'm concerned." The mirror was stubbornly still and silent. "Bedivere, are you there?" Silence. She flipped the heavily ornamented silver lid down, closing the compact with a decisive click, then flipped it open again. "Now is not the time to be temperamental." The mirror shivered as a chuckle tickled its surface.
"Calm yourself, woman. I had another call. You're not my only responsibility."
"The Sherwood case is unraveling. Prioritize." The silver surface of the mirror darkened with his disapproval, but he didn't respond. "The boy learned his name and triggered a countermeasure within the curse, a lethal countermeasure. It must have been tied to the memory-dampening component of the curse."
"You intervened? He's still alive?"
Her tiny compact trembled in her hand, an indication of strong emotion. "He lives. I snatched him from the edge only just in time. But what if—" She couldn't say it.
"If you had been too late? If there are other countermeasures, lethal countermeasures, built into the curse, then she'll be executed. A killing curse executed in full? You can't save her from that."
A sigh rippled across his small mirror.
What was she thinking?
"I don't know." Glenda bit her lip. The pain helped her focus. "She was grief-stricken, not thinking. Surely the council—"
"No."
Bedivere's sharp retort made the compact itself vibrate.
7 years, Glenda. She's had 7 years to make it right. The council will make no allowances for her if Sherwood dies. No special dispensations for her grief or her ties to you.
"If it comes to that," Glenda said, "you must do everything you can."
No.
His voice was firm but softer than before.
Her only chance is to make certain it never comes before the council. Save the Sherwood boy.
Glenda snapped her compact shut. "Math." She nodded. Math would help her make this right. But her confidence wavered. In all her calculations and predictions, she'd missed the countermeasure. She straightened her spine. She would simply have to look more closely, work harder, be better. Neither the Sherwood boy nor her friend would die. She was the maker of improbable matches. What better application of her skill than using love to break a curse, save 2 lives, and find a happily ever after for 2 lonely souls? She could do this. She would make this work. Chapter 11. Hillary sipped her orange juice and eyed Brad across the kitchen table. He'd walked into the kitchen a few minutes ago wearing different clothes than last night. She'd been tired, but not so tired she couldn't remember clothes. If he was Stephen Bradley Sherwood, and chances were looking exceptional that he was, his wardrobe certainly wasn't stuck in 2009. He must have some way to update his appearance, and judging from his haircut, that included more than clothes. "Have you been dressing Gramps for the past few years?" The thought just popped into her head. She'd been so impressed with his ability to keep up, she'd never considered an outside source. Brad's eyes softened, hinting at a smile. "When I met Walter, he was wearing this tatty bathrobe over a white t-shirt, and these old man's slippers were practically falling off his feet. He looked as close to homeless as a guy with a roof over his head can look." "You know my grandmother hadn't been gone for long, right?" Hillary knew she shouldn't be defensive. It had been a long time ago, but she felt guilty, and that made her tone sharper. "I know," he said, eyeing her like she was some unpredictable crazy person. "That was a lifetime ago, and that man that Walter was 7 years ago doesn't have much in common with the man I know." "I'm sorry." She put down the fork she'd been clenching in her hand. "Hard to believe, I know, but I've been worried the past few days. I thought—" She closed her eyes and shook her head. When she opened them, Brad was leaning forward in his chair. "I thought I did something to banish you." She pinched her lips shut and shrugged. "Not sure what you think made me disappear." He hesitated, eyeing her. "Unless you were practicing exorcism rituals on the sly, or praying me away." When she glared, he smiled and said, "You didn't do anything. Like I said, there was a memory charm. I'm willing to bet a bunch of cash I don't have that I'm Stephen Bradley Sherwood. I got that creepy chill, and I think my name triggered the self-destruct on part of the curse." "The timing could have been a coincidence." Hillary's tongue tangled when she tried to say the name, and she decided maybe that was best. They could skip his full name for now. "So, you're Stephen." "Stephen Bradley Sherwood." He squeezed his eyes shut as he said Sherwood. When nothing happened, he opened his eyes. "What do you know? Maybe it's just the first time. If you're asking about my amnesia, I've still got nothing, so I can't be sure, but everything points to him being me. But don't call me Stephen." Hillary nodded. "I've always known you as Brad, even if I did think you were a figment of Gramps' imagination. Brad's easier for me." "You remember those jeans from the 80s? The ones that practically reached his armpits?" Brad asked. A grin escaped before she could stop it. "Yeah, I remember those. I tried, I swear I did, but he wouldn't listen to me. He just said he'd wear them until they wore out and that I should know better than to think he'd waste money buying new clothes when the old ones were still good." "How did you manage to convince him?" "I sold his old stuff on eBay so it wasn't going to waste. That, and I told him I had to look at him more than he looked at himself, so I should at least get veto power on his clothes." Brad relaxed back into his chair again. He didn't really agree with either of those arguments, but I think selling his stuff online was fun, so we ended up reaching a compromise. Eventually, he figured out that updating could be more comfortable and he could still keep his own style. "Nicely done." Brad looked unsure as he said, "At first, the clothes were about getting him out more, an excuse to leave the house. Then I thought maybe he'd be able to meet someone, maybe date, if he looked like he belonged in this century. He's great company, crazy smart, fun to spend time with, and he's not a bad-looking older guy. I mean, what do I know? But it seemed like a good idea." Hillary had to stop and think about how that made her feel. She'd never given Gramps' dating life, even the existence of one, 2 seconds thought. She'd hoped her grandpa would meet more people, get out more, but she hadn't thought so far as dating. Even the word seemed wrong when paired with him. Gramps dating? Gramps getting a life? Moving on, finally? Yeah, I guess that would be cool. More than anything, she wanted him to be happy. Actually, that would be really cool. She finished her now lukewarm scrambled eggs quickly. She needed to move on with her investigation. She had the uncomfortable feeling she'd let her grandpa down in more than one way. Not buying into his Brad stories? Possibly understandable, even considering her more liberal views of the supernatural. But Brad had done more to help Gramps in the last few years than anyone else in the old man's life, including her. She really needed to fix Brad because she didn't think sending the guy who'd been Gramps' best friend for 7 years into oblivion was such a hot idea. She picked up her plate and carried it to the sink. I'm waiting on a copy of a yearbook from Sherwood's high school, your high school. If we can get a photo match, then we'll have proof. Since you can't actually remember.
That's great. He nodded eagerly. I'd love some kind of factual confirmation, and maybe flipping through an old yearbook will jumpstart my memories.
Rinsing her plate and not looking at him, Hillary said, Thanks. She loaded the dishwasher, avoiding any eye contact. I know what you did for him. All the stories he told. I know how much you helped to get him going again. Before Brad could respond, Walter walked into the kitchen.
Thank goodness. About time you were back, Walter said as he entered the kitchen, a broad smile stretched across his face. One more day and it would have been Hillary going to the funny farm, not me.
Hillary blushed. She didn't know why. She'd already admitted she'd been worried. All right, Gramps, that's enough. And you know that no one is talking about institutionalizing anyone. Assisted living is hardly the funny farm. Gramps grinned at her and waggled his eyebrows. He was messing with her. Nice. Served him right if she made him cook for himself, except his scrambled eggs were better than hers, so not really a punishment. You slept late this morning? Gramps gave her an odd look.
It's just now 7.
Hillary blinked in surprise. She must have been up at 6 or 6:30. She'd had no idea, thinking the low light meant it was overcast. She never got out of bed before 8, and 10 was even better, so she didn't really know what a breaking dawn looked like anymore. She was just glad Brad was back. Maybe she'd get a decent night's sleep tonight. An hour later, after she'd dragged her laptop and notes into the kitchen, Hillary found an antique store owned by Glenda Good. But that's as far as she'd gotten. She looked at the scraps of paper with handwritten notes, a few printed articles, photos, and the original list she'd received from Gramps, all spread out in front of her. Sometimes, when she worked, if she could see all of the pieces at once, everything gelled. The cosmic rays aligned, and the whole became greater than the pieces. But not this time. No big picture emerged. No better understanding blossomed. It was just a jumble of rotten, unconnected details. Her head hurt, and she'd been on hold for too long. Placing her hand over her phone, she asked Gramps and Brad, Any chance either of you guys speaks French? 2 heads shook in response. They'd both returned to the kitchen when they'd heard her on the phone. She grumbled her annoyance, but quietly. She might still be able to convince the guy on the phone to try to understand. She was sure he spoke a little English, but that wouldn't happen if he hung up first. Allô? A female voice, possibly quite young, spoke. Hillary removed her hand. Hi, I'm looking for Glenda Good, the owner. Can I speak with Glenda Good? Apologies. How may I help you? Thank you, but it's Glenda I need. It's an emergency. I'm so sorry, I cannot help you. Miss Good, she's gone for the day. I have no number for her. I take a message? The girl's French accent was faint, but for the R's and awkward phrasing, she sounded almost native. Hillary wanted to chuck her phone across the room. What did she care if Glenda's staff spoke perfect English? None of them seemed to be able to accomplish the most basic of tasks, finding their boss and pinning her down for a simple phone conversation. Hillary gritted her teeth in frustration. It was like the woman had a crystal ball and could predict and evade Hillary's calls. Yes, please. Be a dear and ask her to call Hillary right away. Hillary rolled her shoulders as she relayed her number. She ended the call and dropped her phone on the kitchen table. When she looked up, she found both Gramps and Brad giving her similar looks of manly concern. What? She asked with more of an edge than she'd intended.
You're not usually wound quite this tight, Brad shrugged. It's, a little disconcerting.
How would you even know? Hillary closed her eyes and rubbed the heels of her hands in her eyes. Too late, she remembered her makeup, but then she remembered that she hadn't put any on. He had a point. She was not at all herself. You do get that it's creepy, you know that?
Yeah, sorry.
But his apology was more defensive than heartfelt.
7 years, at least one visit a week. You can do the math, but that adds up to a lot.
Gramps looked like he wanted to say something, but kept stopping himself. She stood up and stretched, trying again to ease the aching pull of tired neck muscles. When she was done, she had a brief moment of calm clarity. I'm not crazy. I just pretend to be when under a lot of stress. She huffed out a frustrated breath, annoyed with herself. Trying again, she said simply, I'm sorry.
No apology necessary,
Brad said.
I appreciate everything you're doing. Maybe just don't make yourself sick over it.
Her grandpa hitched a thumb in Brad's direction.
What he said.
Then he walked over and gave her a bear hug. He always squeezed her just a little too tight to be comfortable, and just enough to make her heart happy. Hillary let out a breath that she felt like she'd been holding for days. When Gramps let her go, she fell back into her chair, much of the tension finally gone from her body. After a minute or two, she said, I have a plan. 2 sets of eyes peered intently at her. I should get the yearbook I ordered sometime in the early afternoon, and then we'll have definitive confirmation about Brad's identity and hopefully jog some memories loose in the process. Hillary didn't really have any doubts at this point, but it was a good and logical next step. Why don't we all take a break until then? Gramps, you can take your morning walk. I know you love the trail around my neighborhood. I'm going to take a really long bubble bath and pretend like Glenda is calling us back this afternoon. Brad? She wasn't really sure what Brad did when he wasn't keeping Gramps company. She cringed inwardly. She would hate, with a burning passion, go crazy kind of hate, to live life isolated from people, unable to touch anything. How was he not crazy? Brad lifted both hands.
I'll be fine.
She gave them both a lopsided grin. I feel like we should huddle up and then do a motivational shout-out.
Go Team Walter!
Brad pumped a fist in the air. Hillary grinned, and it felt so good to laugh a bit, even if it was on the inside. Hillary sank into her tub, the bubbles so high they almost spilled over when she was totally submerged, and then her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it, but what if it was Glenda? She dried her hand, tapped the green icon, and then hit speaker. Hello? Are you okay? Beth sounded more than a little concerned. Well, shoot. Do you have some timing or what? I have no idea what you're talking about. I've been trying to catch you for 3 days now. This is just the first time you've answered. I've been worried sick. Oh, I didn't realize. 3 days. Then Hillary remembered with a creeping feeling of guilt how many times she'd thought about returning Beth's calls, but each time she'd stopped herself. At first, because she'd been busy, and then because she didn't want to upset her. Hillary didn't want to burst her newfound love bubble. What's going on? Is this about those glasses? You've been traipsing around the 50s, haven't you? Hillary ducked her head under the bubbles. After a 5 count, she popped back up. She couldn't avoid the question forever. Wiping the bubbles carefully away from her eyes, she said, The glasses are definitely involved. So involved that I'd very much like to speak with our missing witch. She leaned her head back against the tiles. No time travel, though. Uh-oh. Hang on, let me get a cup of coffee and sit down. Or could I stop by? No, probably not a great idea right now. Things are just settling down. Hillary sank lower in the tub and propped her feet up on the ledge. She examined her toes, overdue for a pedicure, while she waited for the background kitchen sounds to die down. Okay, I'm ready. Spill. And Hillary did. Brad's existence as more than a figment of her grandpa's imagination, the looming competency evaluation, Brad's disappearance, Glenda's disappearance, her aunt and uncle's evil schemes. At which point Beth interrupted. You make your aunt and uncle sound Machiavellian. Isn't that a bit much? Is it possible that they're just worried about their dad? Sometimes, Beth, you are frighteningly naive. And a little practical. Yes, it's possible they care. Of course, it's possible they're worried, what with Gramps talking about his imaginary friend, aka his interactive hallucination. But I do think greed factors in. You know the land value on that house, and if it was all about wanting what's best for Gramps, why don't they check on him more often? The water had been slowly cooling and flowing out the overflow drain. Hillary pushed the hot water spigot on with her foot. What happens next? An expert does an evaluation and she diagnoses him with something that means he can't make financial decisions for himself. Hillary. The phone practically vibrated with Beth's exasperation. What? You think you'll get a fair shot? That my aunt and uncle will find some neutral shrink who will actually ask him if he pays his bills on time? Oh, and what about this? Mr. Barrett, would you take Brad's advice in financial matters? Hillary could feel the muscles in her neck knotting again. She forced herself to relax and sink back into the bath. That's actually a reasonable question. Hillary let out a huge sigh. I know, that's the problem. If the honest old guy could just suck it up and lie a little. That's no solution. Walter can't even tell a white lie convincingly. You remember when I went through that phase with the highlights and the bangs? I thought he was going to have a stroke when I asked him what he thought. I really don't see how he managed to stay happily married for so long. You think a happy marriage requires the ability to lie well? Now that is a cynical side of you I haven't seen. Hillary sat up a little straighter. Uh-oh. Have you been fibbing to your honey? There better not be trouble in paradise, not when all heck is breaking loose on my end. We can't have two crises. Certainly we can have two crises. That's simply how the world works. But don't worry, everything's fine. Better than fine. Something in Beth's tone of voice gave her away, and Hillary just knew Edward had finally popped the question officially. For once, Hillary didn't push. Beth would tell her when she was ready. If you say so. So, what do you think? How do we triumph over the evil curse, the evil shrink, the evil relatives? Phew, it's a lot of evil in one gal's life. Simple enough. Solve Brad's problem and you solve Walter's. Don't ghosts hang around when they have unfinished business? Finish Brad's business. As for your relatives, they are not evil. Your Aunt Carol is really sweet. Sometimes. And Tim's probably docile as a lamb with Carol pulling the strings. You're too generous with my family by far. Where did you get the unfinished business thing? Do you have a source I can look up? I need a source? It's all magic and hoodoo. How are their sources? If there were reliable sources, I'd be a little more on board with magic. Hillary dropped under her still plentiful bubbles, this time staying for a 10 count. When she reemerged, she could hear Beth calling her name and asking if she was still there. After she carefully wiped her eyes, Hillary said, You time travel, your boyfriend time travels, and you assume that I've been bouncing around in the 50s the last few days, but you don't believe in magic? That's crazier than all of my psychics, Ghostbusters, tarot readers, and paranormal investigators combined. Hillary turned on the hot water again. Not that any of those people's skills are remotely crazy, I'm just saying. Well, the idea of resolving unfinished business came from somewhere. Maybe there's truth to it. If there is, what's Brad's problem? Something must be tying him to the mortal plane. Oh yeah, that's the second thing. Brad's life is tying him to the mortal plane. He never died. Beth took a moment to respond. Eventually she said, How can a not dead guy be a ghost? A curse. The question is, how do we break it? A low grumbling sound emanated from the phone. It's completely irresponsible of that witch to disappear now. Having someone else angry on her behalf had the odd effect of making Hillary much less upset. She couldn't help a little smile. A shared burden really was lighter. She did try to help Brad, she just got cut off before the big curse-breaking reveal. Maybe you could drop a message for her at the Good Witch, just in case she's ducking my calls? I tracked her last known location to France, but I still couldn't catch her there. Hillary blew at the bubble right under her chin. Although why she's cool talking to Brad and not me, I don't get. That woman seems to have her own agenda, so no telling, but I'll leave a message. Anything else I can do to help? Beth asked. And before you ask, no, I'm not crank calling your aunt or your uncle. Oh, and I'm not testifying that a ghost is a real guy if you can't produce the physical guy. I like not living in a padded cell. Thank you very much. Hillary sighed dramatically. A girl can always hold out hope. And that whole padded cell thing would never happen. You'd only be committed if you were a danger to yourself or others, right?
Silence followed that statement. Hillary waited, scrunching her toes against the cold edge of the tub. Finally, Beth said, "Is there anything that's not unethical or illegal and won't get me arrested or institutionalized that I can do to help?"
That one took a while.
Beth laughed, but when she spoke, her tone was dry. "Just making sure I covered all the bases. You do sound a little better now. Are you going to keep ignoring my calls?"
Nope. I promised to answer the phone. I really am sorry. It's been a rough few days. I'm crazy worried about Gramps, and I'm really disappointed in my family.
Well, I think you're focusing on the wrong things. Your family does love Walter, whatever you may think. And the key to Walter's problem is to fix Brad. Break his curse, corporealize him, whatever. That way you get the win-win-win. Your Gramps safe in his own home after producing his no longer cursed real-life buddy Brad and receiving a clean bill of health from your aunt and uncle's expert.
Gramps home, Brad rescued from not dead, not alive purgatory. What's the third win?
Oh, sweetheart, you are. You'll have solved everyone's problems and can finally let go of whatever has you tied up in knots. Hillary had to think about that. Beth was right. It was more than just Gramps. Heck, she was more worried than he was at this point. A little breath of surprise escaped.
Oh, I like him, Beth. That's my problem. I like Brad, and not in an abstract he helped my grandpa kind of way. All those stories I've heard for years gelled, and he was suddenly a real person who I actually like. A tall, muscular, good-looking real person with a really nice tush, by the way.
Beth's snort interrupted her.
Hey, you hush. You haven't seen him. But this guy, he's real now, and he's in between Gramps and a win at his competency hearing.
No, your good-looking guy is the solution to Walter winning his competency hearing. It's all in how you look at it. With that parting shot, Beth ended the call. Maybe Hillary had been stuck in the past, blaming Brad for creating the problem. She was already working on fixing his non-corporeal state, whatever had caused it. So why was it so hard for her to move forward from this point? To see Beth's win-win-win solution? Chapter 12. Brad had asked Walter to spread the documents Hillary had left on the kitchen table so that he could read them all. While Hillary had taken the longest bath ever, was that a girl thing? He'd reviewed all of the information Hillary had found while he'd been recharging. When she finally walked in, her dark hair damply curling around her face, he'd finished reading most of the documents. Yearbook picture confirmation or not, he was certain he was Stephen Bradley Sherwood. Once he'd read the article that mentioned his mother, there had been no doubt in his mind. None. He sat up from the slouched position he'd assumed in the corner of the kitchen and asked, "Good bath?" Hillary jumped.
Gah! That's creepy. You make no noise. Seriously, none.
Sorry, it's part of the package. Walter and I hypothesized that not much substance means not much noise. Brad shrugged. Speaking is another question entirely.
I'm going with magic.
Hillary frowned and walked further into the room.
Are you okay? You look...
She screwed her lips up.
You look weird,
she says to a ghostly figure lurking in the corner. Arms crossed, she said.
You know what I mean. What gives?
I read the article about me, Sherwood, going missing and the police calling off the search.
Hillary's arms fell back to her sides and she sat down. She looked worried. Do you think there's any possibility that you tried...
She gave him a nudge-nudge, wink-wink type of look. It took him a few seconds to realize what she was talking about. A sharp bark of laughter slipped out. No way. I did not try to kill myself. Her eyebrows drew close together. She was adorable, like some guy's cute kid sister. Some guy he didn't know. Some guy who wouldn't mind if he grabbed a hold of her. He cleared his throat. The article mentioned my mom. Her face cleared. Became completely blank, in fact.
Yes.
Speaking carefully, as if considering every word, she said,
I looked for her. What I found isn't here.
She waved a hand at the table of materials.
But I did look, and I found your mom. He leaned forward and put his elbows on the table.
And?
And she moved away. Not long after your funeral. I don't think she ever believed you,
Killed myself, you can say it. We both know I didn't actually do it, so it's not a problem for me to talk about it.
Brad was 99.9% sure he hadn't even tried. But without his memory, he had only his gut to rely upon. It seemed so completely wrong, and when he'd run into facts from his previous life, they'd clicked on some intrinsic level. And there was no funky chill of confirmation on hearing the word suicide. Okay, so I'm sure she didn't believe you killed yourself. There's a website. Hillary's blank facade slipped and she winced. A conspiracy theorist website. Brad blew out a breath and then pushed himself away from the table. His mom had lost it, at least in regards to his disappearance. There was no other explanation for Hillary's hesitance. On a positive note, the site hasn't seen much activity for several months. Hillary tilted her head, giving him a concerned look. Maybe she's started to move on?
Either way, there's no simple solution. I come back after she has come to terms and it's all opened up again. Or I never come back and she's left with this question. And how do I explain where I've been?
We move one step at a time, and the first step for all of us is to kick your curse in the privates. We need to break it into little tiny pieces.
You have some thoughts on how to do that?
Before she could answer his question, someone knocked on the front door and Hillary popped up like an over-caffeinated terrier. She came back clutching his high school yearbook and a shredded, padded envelope. Victory!
You found me?
She wrinkled her nose at him. If she wasn't so cute, it would be obnoxious. She sat down at the kitchen table and started flipping through the pages. Finding the book was no small accomplishment. You couldn't let me revel for 2 seconds.
Sorry.
He wasn't, but he could be polite.
Try the index?
He expected a glare, but she just grinned and said, "Oh yeah," and flipped to the back of the book.
I wonder why all this stuff isn't online.
Hillary raised an eyebrow. Says the guy who should be 7 years behind on technology. A lot of them are scanned via third-party services, but not yours. Ha! She gave him a significant look and deliberately said, Victory. She flipped the book around and tapped her finger on a picture. Brad, but several years younger. They both shared a look, followed by silence. So that was kinda anticlimactic, Hillary said.
Yeah, we were both already sold on the idea.
Yeah. Walter strolled in and gave them both a concerned look.
Bad news?
No. Hillary handed him the open book. Walter nodded, looking at the picture.
Bit of a letdown, since we already knew.
But now we know for sure. Next on the agenda, break the curse. She tipped her head to the side. Okay, first figure out how to break the curse, then break the curse. I think regaining your memory would be a solid step in the right direction.
Got it. Finding out more about his former self appealed on more than one level, but certainly if it got him closer to a normal, fully physical life, he was all in. Who's turning pages for me? My walk cleared my head and knocked the cobwebs out.
Walter took the yearbook from Hillary and sat down at the table.
So I'm raring to go. And while we're working on this, Hillary, maybe it's time to call that fella that does the paranormal investigations, unless you've had some luck getting in touch with your witch friend.
Walter gave Hillary a hopeful look. Nope, Hillary replied. Paranormal investigator it is, but we have to drop the guy a letter at his postbox, remember? That whole hired assassin image he has going on.
You can skip the analogies to hitmen. This whole thing is about not taking me out. I'd like to be more alive, not less.
When no one replied, Brad turned to Walter and said,
Start at the index. See if I'm anywhere else in the book. Then we can go page by page.
Hillary pulled up a chair next to Walter's for Brad and then disappeared to write their pitch for the paranormal investigator. Thoughtful of her, but he'd like to pull out his own chair. Soon, he hoped. Chapter 13. It hadn't taken Hillary long to draft the note. She'd been living and breathing Brad's messed up, non-corporeal story for several days now. To say it was on her brain was an understatement. She kept it short, trying to intrigue with a mysterious pitch, but also promising prompt cash payment for results. The postbox address was a little shop not far from Hillary's house, not in her neighborhood, but close enough that she usually passed it a few times a week. So she opted to simply drive it there in hopes of speeding the process up a bit. "Anyone coming with?" she hollered. "Leaving to drop the note in 5. Gramps and Brad both responded in the affirmative, and the three of them piled into her car a few minutes later. It took Hillary a few minutes to remember that her shotgun passenger wasn't visible to the public. "Okay, super weird that no one is sitting in the front and you're in the back, Gramps." It was also the closest she'd been to Brad. His less than substantial form was unsettling. "You can see me. Good enough," Brad said. Hillary didn't respond. She was too worried about this paranormal investigator guy. What if he had no clue? Worse, what if he had a clue and took it upon himself to exorcise Brad? And that's when she realized she couldn't do it. A few days ago, what seemed like a lifetime ago, she would have been open to all of the possibilities, breaking the curse and making Brad corporeal, or just making him disappear so that her grandpa could attest to the fact that he did indeed live alone. A real-life Brad or no Brad, same result. Her Gramps wouldn't appear to be actively hallucinating. But now her gut rebelled at the thought of Brad disappearing into the ether to either live out the rest of his life who knew where, or to simply wink out of existence. "We need to be careful." She met her grandpa's gaze in the rearview mirror. "We don't have much information, and that gives the investigator more power. How can we tell if this guy knows his stuff, or that he isn't doing whatever he thinks is best regardless of what we're asking for?" "Sounds paranoid, and I'm the one with his life on the line." Brad tried to catch her eye. "Weren't you the one who said you'd do whatever it took to sort out Walter's problem?" Gramps cleared his throat. "Sorry," Brad said quietly. "No, you're right." Hillary looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. "You're okay. You're more than okay. I don't want you to disappear into some great dark nothingness." Maybe a little harsh to say out loud, but it was a possibility. "Maybe I wasn't as sensitive about that when you first popped up." Apparently, Brad didn't have a response to that, and Gramps was wise enough to know when to pretend to be hard of hearing. Hillary drove the rest of the way in silence, hoping that this paranormal investigator wasn't a giant fraud or too caught up in his own agenda to be trusted. She might have spared a minute or two to hope she wasn't becoming a conspiracy nut, and she definitely sent an ill thought, or 3, Glenda's way. When they arrived at the mail store, Gramps awoke with a start. He hadn't just been quiet, he'd fallen asleep. Hard to do in the cramped back seat. Which begged the question of how Brad had ended up in the front. "You guys coming inside?" Hillary asked. "We came this far." Gramps stretched as best he could in the confines of the back seat. "Let's go." "And I thought you were just along for the Dairy Queen stop I'm making on the way home." Hillary walked in, making an attempt to be casual about holding the door for Brad. She'd been meaning to ask him if he could pop through walls. Surely he'd have to, otherwise he wouldn't be able to move nearly so freely as she thought he could. She'd ask on the way home. "Hi." Hillary put on a bright smile. The small, wiry, unshaven man behind the counter tried to return her smile, but was only successful in producing a tired facsimile. "How may I help you?" "I need to deliver a letter to a postbox here. It's urgent, so is there any way to drop it directly in the box without sending through the local mail processing center?" Hillary tried her cute and charming approach, but she could already see it was falling short. "That's highly irregular, and I'm not sure it's legal. I'd have to check." His features were scrunched up into a look of displeasure, then suddenly his expression changed. "Which box?" "Oh, 74? Hillary watched in surprise as the clerk's demeanor changed. "Ah," the clerk said. "That's fine, I can take it." Hillary must have looked suspicious because he quickly added, "I'll deliver it now." "Any chance this guy is an agent for the investigator?" Brad asked. Hillary kept her eyes on the clerk as she said, "I don't think so." The clerk looked confused. "Do you want me to deliver it or not?" "No," Gramps said before Hillary could reply. "Thank you." Since he was leaving and Hillary knew Gramps was nobody's fool, she followed him. "Wait," the clerk called after them. "You have a special problem?" Hillary hovered on the threshold as her grandpa held the door open. Did Gramps just wink at her? No way. This was the guy? Gramps had not only known, he'd called the guy's bluff. go Grandpa. When she turned back around and got a second look at the PI, all she could think was, paranormal investigator her tush. She didn't see a harried and disheveled clerk saving all their rears with a curse-breaking spell. She almost walked out the door. Almost. But their options were limited to two, and with Glenda in the wind, really just one. And Gramps had followed her back inside without any qualms, so he must not be as appalled by the choice as she was. She sighed then and told the mail clerk, wannabe paranormal investigator, "We need a curse broken."
Chapter 14.
Hillary's first impression hadn't been exactly spot on. The clerk was, in fact, the owner, and he'd been in the business for 5 years. His name was Archibald Schmidt, but everyone called him Smitty, and in his 5 years of paranormal investigating, he'd encountered ghosts and witches. That's as far as the brief interview Gramps conducted had progressed before a legitimate customer had arrived. How much action he'd seen in those 5 years remained an unknown, as did whether he had any curse-breaking knowledge. Smitty had been more than curious about the job. He'd displayed a childlike giddiness, in fact. One that he tried and miserably failed to hide. So Hillary guessed not that much paranormal action actually came Smitty's way. But Hillary hadn't vetted his background and qualifications further. There'd been no time, as customers kept streaming in. And with Glenda in the wind, they didn't have an alternative to Smitty, the giddy post office-owning paranormal investigator. Hillary stepped into line, quickly scheduled an appointment for a few hours later, Smitty's earliest availability and likely when his shift ended, and then she left. Almost exactly 2 hours later, he'd appeared at the agreed-upon coffee shop. She eyed him critically as he set his coffee down on the edge of the table and barely caught it before it tipped over. She sighed. Not promising. Brad wasn't so circumspect. "You've got to be kidding me. We can't put my life in this guy's hands." Smitty had come close to sitting in Brad's chair, on top of Brad. Hillary didn't like to think about the permutations of what might happen in that situation. Another question she needed to ask Brad when they had a spare moment. But Smitty's unknowing gaffe had certainly contributed to Brad's ill humor. "Give him a chance," Gramps said, giving Brad a sharp look. Hillary squeezed her eyes. This was the root of all evil. "Gramps, we're trying to prove you're not a crazy person, remember?" Gramps huffed. "He's a paranormal investigator. He should be used to this kind of thing." Smitty's eyes bulged as he looked between her, Gramps, and what must look like an empty seat. "There's some kind of confidentiality here, right?" Hillary snapped her fingers in front of Smitty's face. When he blinked and looked away from Brad's chair, she repeated, "Confidentiality?" Smitty frowned at her and then seemed to gather himself. "Absolutely. I guarantee discretion." He lowered his voice. "Do I understand correctly that you're being haunted?" He didn't wait for a reply, just barreled on. "That's unusual. It's usually a physical location and the ghosts I've encountered don't travel. But we can do a ritual cleansing? Wait, you mentioned a curse. So one of you is cursed, and that's why the ghost is tied to you?" Hillary exchanged a look with Gramps. He inclined his head, so she took a breath and spilled the whole story. And Smitty stepped up. No shock or confusion. He just took out a notepad, jotted down notes, asked a few businesslike questions, and generally looked almost competent. When she finished, Hillary said, "Well, what do you think?" "I think your witch Glenda is in this up to her chin, and she has a bizarre sense of humor. Glenda Good and the Good Witch Shop?" Smitty shook his head and frowned. He didn't quite make a tisk-tisk sound, but it sat on the tip of his tongue. Smitty belonged to the camp that believed one must keep paranormal goings-on well under the radar of normal folk. His attempt at a discreet contact method should have tipped her off. "All right, Captain Obvious. We're aware Glenda's involved and probably knows how to break the curse, but she's not available. What do we do?" Brad crossed his arms over his chest. How did a ghost stay in shape? Brad's biceps showed off quite nicely in that t-shirt. "Hillary, are you okay?" Brad asked, his overt annoyance fading. Hillary sighed. Definitely not okay. She was losing it. Or she was finally coming out of her stress-induced funk. She was hardly one to miss noticeable haughty attributes, even on a ghost. "Yep, all good." Turning to Smitty, she said, Our friend Brad has pointed out the futility of relying on Glenda for a resolution. What are your ideas?
Pay attention. This part is very important. Gramps gave Smitty his best impersonation of a trustworthy but stern old dude. Evidence points to a curse, which makes Brad an innocent victim and someone we want to protect.
Right. No exercising our cursed buddy Brad. Hillary may have been a little too exuberant in her defense because a woman sitting at an adjacent table looked suddenly very curious about their conversation. Hillary flashed the older woman a brilliant smile and said, "New movie." The woman quickly looked away. Lines of concentration appeared on Smitty's face, or he had indigestion. After a few minutes, he said, "I only know 2 ways to break curses. If it's the religious kind, then prayer. The second way, and I only know this from research, not first-hand experience." Surprise, surprise, but Hillary made encouraging gestures. "Well, there's always an out, built into the curse." Smitty smiled. "So find the out, and you can break the curse." He looked really proud of himself, so Hillary almost felt bad about bursting his bubble. "Here's the thing, Smitty. We don't know how he was cursed or what exactly the curse is, and yet you think we can figure out what the loophole is? How should we do that?"
"In less than 3 days," Brad reminded her. She relayed the deadline to Smitty. "Wait, there's a deadline? What happens in a week? No one mentioned any kind of time pressure. He's been like this for 7 years. How is this all of a sudden a problem that has to be fixed right now?" As he spoke, Smitty became more and more agitated. If Hillary had to guess, she'd say he was a tightly wound guy, even on the best of days. How did a guy like this ever end up in the paranormal investigation biz? Gramps raised his index finger. "That would be my fault. I've got an evaluation with a psychiatrist coming up in a few days and eventually a hearing. It's a long story and you don't need the details. Let's chat, Mr. Smitty, about this loophole and some way to discover how Brad was cursed. Let's start there, shall we?" "Yes, how he was cursed would be very helpful information," Smitty agreed.
"We don't have a name, but we can almost certainly find it. Don't give me that judgy look, Mr. Schmidt. It's just come to light that Brad's old girlfriend was a witch, and her mom was the one who cursed him. We don't know exactly why, but we can guess. Her daughter died in a car accident exactly 1 year before Brad was cursed. Brad was driving."
Smitty nodded. "The mother seeks vengeance or justice."
Hillary threw her hands up. "It was an accident. He wasn't drinking or doing anything irresponsible, not so far as we can tell. Who sentences a guy like this?" Hillary flung her hand in Brad's direction. "Just because he was there."
"She has to believe the accident was Brad's fault," Gramps said. "And he wasn't just there, he was driving. I can't imagine the grief of losing a child. It's quite possible she's not thinking rationally."
7 years later and she's still not seeing reason? I don't buy it.
Getting worked up wasn't helping anyone, so Hillary shook her head and tried to focus on something helpful.
"What does this information get us?"
Smitty used his pen as a pointer and moved through each point in his notes. After he reached the last scribble, he looked up and said, "If the mother blames him, she wants justice or vengeance. In either case, there are 2 choices. You have to either convince her of Brad's innocence or convince her to forgive him. I think." He shrugged and smiled apologetically.
"Yes, forgive. That's what Glenda said to Brad before she got cut off, right?"
Hillary looked to Brad for confirmation. He looked bemused, but he nodded. "True, but there wasn't any context. Forgive the person who cursed me? Get her to forgive me? Forgive myself? No idea." "So get the witch to forgive Brad and she might lift the curse," Smitty said. "There is a second option. A loophole, basically a way to break the curse built into the curse itself. It can be a weakness or even something placed intentionally by the cursing party. Think of the old fairy tales. Once the lesson was learned, the curse was broken. Or meet a set of potentially arbitrary circumstances and the curse is broken."
Hillary pulled a tiny little used notepad out of her purse. She usually used a dictation app on her phone, but that didn't seem appropriate. She scribbled a few notes on the options Smitty had provided so they could mull them over later, but the choice seemed pretty clear. "Well, we're on a deadline, and figuring out a set of arbitrary circumstances sounds pretty time-consuming. If forgiveness is important, then either Grace's mom has to forgive Brad before she'll remove the curse, or Brad has to forgive someone in order to trigger some loophole in the curse. Right?"
Again, Smitty offered an apologetic smile. "I think so. Maybe. I mean, it's hard to say, but for sure the person who has done the cursing should be able to break it. Hillary wanted to tear her hair out in frustration, except then she'd have to get new extensions. Hair tearing was a bad idea.
Why can't there be a clear answer?
Gramps reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "'Cause that's how life is, Peanut. It's complicated and uncertain and messy."
I don't know. I think that's just what happens when magic gets involved.
Hillary gave him a dour look, but she also gave his fingers a quick squeeze before he let go. "I'm with Walter," Brad said. "Magic adds another dimension, but guaranteed the root of all this is a parent's reaction to losing a child."
Smitty assumed an apologetic demeanor, flushed a light pink color, and addressed the empty chair.
"You're sure you weren't impaired in any way at the time of the accident?" "I don't think so." Brad shook his head.
Hillary felt for him. He didn't think he'd done anything, and the reports they'd read supported that conclusion. But to have no actual memory of the accident, what a terrible thing. She quickly answered, "Nothing in any of our research indicates that he was. In fact, it specifically says he wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol in a few of the news reports."
"Well, then I'd focus on the two options we discussed, winning over the mother and working out if Brad's forgiveness of himself or Grace or the mother plays some part in a loophole, or out, built into the curse." "Getting my memory back about now would be convenient." Brad scrubbed his hands across his face. Hillary watched in fascination as his hands and face briefly merged together around the edges. Hillary had to peel her eyes away. Turning back to Smitty, she pulled a card from her purse and handed it to him.
"Thank you for all your help. If there's anything else that you can think of, can you give me a call? As you know, we're on a tight deadline."
"Of course." Smitty stood up and reached out his hand. Hillary shook his hand, and then Gramps. Smitty nodded in Brad's direction. "No charge. I didn't have anything concrete, and I don't charge for initial consults anyway." He lowered his voice and said in a conspiratorial tone, "Have to weed out the crackpots." Hillary smiled. He'd grown on her. He was still annoying, but he was a good-hearted, well-intentioned guy, if nervy and a little odd.
"Thank you, truly, Smitty. We appreciate your help."
Once he'd left, Hillary turned to Brad.
"Your memory is #1 priority for the rest of the day. That and any information we can find on Grace, her mom, and the accident."
"Agreed. Let's get this show on the road, Peanut. We need to get back to the house and dig up some information." Gramps was already standing, ready to go.
Brad was curiously silent, both in the coffee shop and on the ride home. Hillary worried about him. There were questions none of them had addressed, and they had to be weighing on him. If he did regain his physicality, how would he explain his disappearance? If he didn't, was something worse in store for him, or would he be in ghostly form forever? Those were just a few of the questions floating around in Hillary's head. She could only imagine what Brad had come up with. Chapter 15. 2 hours of looking over Hillary's shoulder, and Brad felt like punching a wall. Except he couldn't actually punch a wall, and he wasn't the kind of guy who derived satisfaction from smashing things. He rubbed his face. "You look like you need a break." Hillary peered up at him. "Seriously, I'm the one typing and getting the sore mouse-clicking finger, but you're the one looking wiped. Something's wrong with this picture."
She did that a lot, poked at him when he wasn't at his best.
Probably a backhanded attempt at kindness, and he had no doubt that she was kind, wrapped up in a somewhat stressy, high-energy package, but at the core was kindness.
"It's frustrating, watching you dig through all of these articles without being able to do the research myself."
"And without finding much."
He ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, that too. How is the tragic death of a young woman so hard to find? It shouldn't be difficult, especially since we know I was the driver. You'd think it would be plastered all over the news."
"Oh, there's magic involved. I bet my next pedicure."
She gave him a crooked smile.
"That's good, though. It means the accident and the information related to it is important somehow."
He felt sick that a woman had died while he'd been driving. Even worse, that woman had been someone he must have loved, and he couldn't remember even the smallest detail about her, not her name, the color of her hair, nothing. The gaping hole in his memory felt horridly wrong, different somehow than the rest of his missing memories. Maybe it had something to do with the guilt that Mary Margaret had detected in his aura.
Hillary's phone chirped, pulling him back to the present. She picked up her phone absent-mindedly, but after a quick glance, her attention sharpened. I didn't know it was possible to send text messages from a blocked number.
That doesn't seem right. Trash it, it's probably a virus.
Seriously, how do you stay up to date? You don't even have a phone, Hillary said as she tapped the screen. It's a website. She tapped the screen again. Served her right if she ended up on a porn site. He was about to tell her so when she turned to her computer and started typing. After a few seconds, she tipped her laptop screen back so he could better see the web page displayed. He felt gut-punched. You getting that creepy chill again? Hillary asked. It's her, isn't it? The site was a virtual memorial for a pretty, dark-haired petite girl who died a little over 8 years ago in a car accident. No name, just pictures. Why no name? Hillary whispered. And why have a memorial site that people can't easily find? A clue from Glenda? A legitimate memorial, but altered and hidden by her mother?
It's her.
He knew it the moment the picture appeared. An uneasy feeling, a foreboding overcame him when he looked at her picture.
It's definitely Grace.
Walter had gone home to water his plants, retrieve the mail, and do those routine things that make people feel comfortable in their own space. He hadn't yet returned when Hillary made her big discovery, a comment on the memorial site by one of Grace's friends, a friend who was alive, easily discoverable through social media, and happy to answer a few questions for a memorial article about Grace. Jackpot! Hillary clicked out of the messaging app she'd used to interview Grace's friend Sarah.
You're suspiciously good at lying through your teeth,
Brad said. I'm completely comfortable with that aspect of my personality, but it makes Beth uncomfortable too. She spun around in her chair to face him. Grace Galloway. Her mom's name is Adele, and the accident was just outside of town. I don't know the exact spot, but I'm familiar with the area, and Sarah said it's marked.
Brad stood, stunned. This was it.
Hillary bit her lip and wiggled in her chair. So, what do you think? We go, right? Brad wasn't sure how he felt, but he knew without doubt they had to see the crash site.
We go.
Since Walter was at home and neither of them wanted to bother him if the trip didn't pan out, Hillary and Brad drove to the crash site without him. They spent the first several minutes in silence. Brad suspected Hillary was giving him time to digest the new information. But they hadn't learned much. What he needed was time, more time than they had, to prepare himself for a nasty memory dump. He'd seen a woman die. That he might regain those memories was both a terrifying and an empowering prospect. Any piece of his past regained was a step closer to becoming whole again. But he couldn't even imagine what this particular memory looked like. Hillary's eyes darted between him and the road. It's not much further. Brad nodded. You haven't remembered anything else?
No, other than an absolute certainty it's her. Nothing.
Brad turned to watch the passing landscape in the hopes it might trigger some other memory. Grace. A simple, somewhat old-fashioned name. Grace Galloway. If the name was old-fashioned, the woman on the site certainly hadn't been. Vibrant, cheerful, fun, and thoroughly modern. The classic name didn't seem to suit her, and it didn't taste right in his mouth. You're sure you're good with this plan? Hillary asked, worry creeping into her voice. The last time we made a breakthrough into your past, you disappeared for 3 days. The car slowed, but Brad doubted Hillary even realized she'd dropped down 5 miles under the speed limit.
I'm sure.
A thought distracted him momentarily from the fear of what he'd discover.
Where exactly did that text come from? I mean, it has to be Glenda, but why won't she just call?
Or call us back. Hillary's hands were wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. They were pulling off the road to the shoulder. Then he saw it, what Hillary must have spotted from the road. Flowers in varying stages of decay or desiccation, a photo, a cross planted firmly in the ground. Brad debated pushing himself through the car's door, an unpleasant but effective method of escape when he was caught in enclosed spaces, but Hillary hopped out of the driver's seat before he could summon the effort. She waited, holding the door, shifting uneasily from foot to foot. He crawled out on the driver's side without taking his eyes off the piles of flowers. Some were fresh. The thud of the car door closing startled him. I'm coming with you, Hillary said, her tone hard to read and her face carefully blank. It was a silly statement. They were parked no more than 15 feet from Grace's memorial. But Brad knew what she meant. Absolutely. The road hadn't looked familiar. The roadside spot littered with flowers and marked by the cross certainly didn't. The picture he recognized, but only because it had been on the website. Whoever had chosen the picture had made an odd choice. It wasn't the happiest or the prettiest picture. Grace sat in a swing that hung from a tree, and she looked off into the distance rather than at the photographer. Brad took a step closer. Then he fell to his knees. A sharp pain, needles, knives, a hacksaw pushing into his brain, tearing, ripping, shredding, fading. He reached for his head, expecting a wet, bloody mess, but he felt only his hair. He tried to stand, but his vision swam, and he sank to the ground. Chapter 16. Hillary watched in horror as Brad staggered, clutched his head, and fell to the ground. By the time she thought to pull out her phone and dial 911, she realized 911 wouldn't help, because he had no physical body. She fell to her knees next to him. "Can you hear me?" He nodded. "Can I do anything?" She reached out to try to touch him, but all she felt was cold and a thickening of the air. Her eyes could see him, but her hand couldn't feel him. The juxtaposition of incompatible realities made her head spin. She jerked her hand back. He tried to answer, but no words came out. He writhed on the ground, so clearly in pain, but he didn't cry out. Or he couldn't. Hillary tried desperately to think of anyone who might help, anyone who would know what to do. She dug through her contacts for the Good Witch shop. No chance Glenda would be in now, not after so many failed attempts to contact her, but Hillary had to try. There was no one else. She tapped the call button. "The Good Witch, how can I help you?" Glenda said in calm tones. "It's me. It's Hillary. Brad's here. We're at the crash site and he's hurt. I don't know what to do." She tried to stay calm, but the last word came out almost as a wail. "He's fine." "He's not fine," Hillary snapped. What was wrong with this woman? "Hillary, listen to me. You've broken the rest of the memory charm. Sherwood is getting his memory back, and it's not an easy process. But it won't damage him. Are you listening to me, Hillary? He won't be damaged. Just tell him it's going to be okay, and it will be over soon." In some part of her brain, Hillary knew she should keep Glenda on the phone, ask her as many questions as she could, and store up that information for later. Because Brad was fine. Glenda said he was fine. But Hillary was looking at him, and he wasn't fine. She set the phone down on the ground. "You're okay. I talked to Glenda." Hillary would almost swear he choked on a laugh. "Really, I did. She said you're remembering. It's just going to be a little while, and then you'll be all right." Hillary watched him roll on the ground, his hands clutching at his head, and she hoped she hadn't lied. Glenda hadn't actually said how long this pain would last. Oh no, please don't let it be much longer. She inched closer and reached her hand out, but didn't touch him. "Everything's okay. You're going to be fine, just fine. It won't be long." And then it was over. Brad's form stilled, and Hillary had a brief second to see his pale, worn face before he disappeared. She sat there staring at the place he'd occupied for some amount of time, she didn't know how long, before she finally remembered Glenda. She looked for the phone and found it a few feet away. But there was no one on the line. She considered dialing her again, but she just knew that Glenda wouldn't be there. Tired, confused, and more worried for Brad than she probably should be, she got into her car and headed to Gramps' house. She had to update him, and that was a conversation better had in person. Brad? Steve. He'd have to pick one. He thought about it, considered what felt right. Brad. He'd been Brad for 7 years, and he wasn't that same kid who'd dated Grace, or the same kid who'd driven that car 8 years ago. Brad sat down in the grass a few feet away from Grace's memorial. He could jog home. It would take him a few hours, but he could do it, and he would in a little while. He remembered the picture. He'd actually taken it. Grace's father had died a few days earlier. They hadn't been close, but she'd been unprepared and had taken it hard. It seemed an especially strange choice for her memorial. Not only did it not show the woman he'd loved so long ago, there was nothing of her happy, carefree nature in that picture, but the memorial had to have been created by Adele. Why would Adele choose a picture taken by the man she must hate more than any other? Of course, that hatred hadn't begun with the accident. Adele had always disapproved of him. He'd never been good enough for her daughter, maybe in part because he wasn't the same as Grace and Adele. He was a man with no magic. At the time, he'd known nothing of witches, nothing of spells or curses or magic. He had shrugged away Adele's dislike and said she'd come around. When Grace had worried over her mother's disapproval and the way her mother treated him, Brad had teased her into a better mood. In retrospect, maybe Adele had been right. Maybe he hadn't been good enough for Grace. But he'd loved her as best he could. In his youth and inexperience, he may not always have made the best choices, but he'd loved Grace. More importantly, she'd felt loved, and she'd been happy. He knew the truth. Grace had died in an accident he couldn't prevent. He'd loved her in every way he'd known how. She'd been happy with their lives together and excited for their next adventure. And yet the weight of a terrible guilt still weighed on him. The weight had been eased somewhat by his lapse in memory, but the very act of robbing his memories had frozen them in place. The grief and the guilt had lingered, muted and hidden, but still there. A few pieces of the curse's puzzle finally fit together. He knew with a profound certainty one person he needed to forgive. Himself. Maybe acceptance and forgiveness would help break the curse. Maybe it wouldn't. But that vague sense of unease, that taint of guilt that permeated his aura, it had been with him for the last 7 years. Carrying it, even unknowingly, could have made him weaker and more susceptible to the curse. Maybe. Whether his own forgiveness played a part or not, he now understood why he'd been cursed. He wasn't meant to feel guilt or grief, nor to share Adele's pain. That had certainly been an accident, because Adele would want to claim Grace's loss as hers and hers alone. And if her curse made him nothing, if he was no one with no connection to the world or the people in it, then the grief of her lost child was kept all to herself. And that isolation worked twofold. It also acted as his punishment for taking her daughter away. At least now he could guess why she hadn't simply killed him right away. But Glenda had found a way to twist the curse. Who else but Glenda could have orchestrated his introduction to Walter, made certain that Walter could see and hear him, found a champion, as initially reluctant as she might have been, in Hillary? Without Glenda or Walter, without Hillary, it was too terrible to contemplate. Brad felt a nasty chill, but this time it was a wave of cold that traveled through his whole body, not just his spine. He knew Adele had resented his relationship with her only daughter, but this was like nothing he could ever have imagined, and he had no idea how to win over a woman who acted with such nasty, vile intent. Chapter 17. Hillary had traded off with Gramps, one or the other of them driving by Grace's memorial site every few hours. It had been 12 hours, but surprisingly it had only taken until the 3rd hour of Brad's disappearance for Hillary to reach an astounding conclusion. Aunt Carol and Uncle Tim might possibly not be the offspring of Satan. It was amazing how motivating fear could be. First, she'd been driven by her fear that Gramps would lose his home and his independence, and now by the fear that a man both she and Gramps cared about might lose his life. In light of the escalating danger to Brad as they delved deeper into his curse, it was much easier to see her own biases. She'd approached her Gramps' competency evaluation with a bullheadedness that both Beth and her grandpa had tried to point out to her. Maybe, for a moment, if she could see her aunt and uncle as allies and not enemies, a solution could be found. She and Gramps had talked, something about priorities, mending fences, maybe some other stuff that had to do with her being unreasonable, maybe an apology. Gramps had admitted that maybe Tim and Carol thought Hillary was a bad influence with her psychics and tarot and crystals, but that they really liked her, something Hillary had always doubted. Hillary had acknowledged her bias against her relatives, and Gramps his soft-heartedness for his children. And then they'd moved on. Most importantly, the two of them had come up with a plan to fix Gramps' problem. While neither of them wanted Gramps to get booted from his house, after a small perspective adjustment, that problem seemed infinitely more solvable than Brad's curse. But then came the difficult part. She'd swallowed her anger and her pride, and she'd called first Aunt Carol and then Uncle Tim. She'd done her best to pitch a reasonable alternative to placing Gramps in a home, one she hoped that they were considering even now. She put her turn signal on and started to slow down, knowing now from experience that the memorial was just up ahead. As she pulled onto the shoulder, she saw him. He was sitting cross-legged not far from Grace's memorial. He looked to be lost in thought and didn't even appear to have noticed her. She sat in the car and waited because she didn't want to disturb him. If Glenda hadn't erred grossly, Brad had his memory back. And this was a memorial site for the man's deceased girlfriend. 5 minutes went by, then 10. She started to worry that he remembered his past, but not his present. 3 more minutes. Or he was angry. 5 more minutes. Or something terrible, more terrible than the pain she'd witnessed on this roadside 12 hours ago, had happened to him. Finally, he stood up and walked to the car. As he got closer, she realized she'd never asked whether he could pass through solid walls, so she reached across the passenger seat and shoved the door open.
"Hey, thanks for waiting."
His voice sounded normal enough. He looked okay, no glowing red eyes or other signs of demonic possession. "No problem. You're okay?" Awkwardly, she reached over him to close the door. Physical contact seemed like a really bad idea. Funny, that wasn't exactly her normal attitude with hot guys.
"Yeah, I've actually been here a while. I just wanted a few more minutes to say goodbye. I'm not planning to come back."
Hillary glanced at him before she pulled out onto the road, but he was staring straight ahead. They'd driven for several minutes in silence when Brad spoke again.
"I'm okay. Really. I remember everything. Who I am, Grace, the accident, Grace's mother, Adele. It's a lot to process, but I'm good. How long have I been gone? And what about Walter's exam?"
"You've been gone 12 hours? About Gramps? I think we came up with a solution. I'm waiting to hear back, but I think it's good." She threw a smile his way. "You're actually responsible. Grandpa and I decided your curse was more important."
"Then Walter's life?"
Brad's incredulous voice bounced around inside the tiny car.
"I was only gone half a day."
"Yeah, well, we both decided there was a perception problem. I tweaked the equation, admitted that perhaps Aunt Carol and Uncle Tim aren't evil-doing masterminds, and that opened up some alternatives. So really, it's not about your problem being more important, it's about Gramps' situation becoming less of a problem. There you have it." Hillary didn't think it was the right time to tell him that neither she nor her grandpa had been able to handle the thought of Brad's curse getting the better of him. His second unexpected disappearance, much sooner than was normal, according to Gramps, had them scared witless.
"Wow. I hope it all works out."
He gave her a curious look. She pretended not to notice because she didn't want to jinx it. She'd explain if and when all the pieces fell into place. They should know soon. "So, you have your memory back. Any ideas on how we're going to break your curse?"
"Yeah, I might have one or two, but I'd like to confirm my suspicions with Glenda. Let's see if she answers the call this time."
Hillary wouldn't count on it, even though the elusive witch had picked up earlier. But she could hope. Chapter 18. Walter opened the door looking more haggard than Brad had seen in a long time. His unexpected disappearances and the stress of breaking the curse were aging the guy. Since Walter was in his 70s, that was no good.
"Hey, Walter, I'm fine, and I'm really sorry to worry you guys like this."
"Not your fault, son. Come on in."
Walter opened the door wide and waved him through. As Hillary passed by, he reached out and gave her a quick hug.
"Good job, Peanut."
Walter headed into the kitchen with Brad and Hillary in tow. When they arrived, he immediately poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed Hillary one and said to Brad,
"Wish you could join us."
Hillary took a sip of whiskey and wheezed out a small cough. Once she'd recovered, she said, "We've got some good news. Brad has his memory back." Brad grimaced.
"The bad is that I'm still not certain on how to break the curse. I've got a few ideas, but they're guesses based on what I know about Adele, specifically what I know about Grace's relationship with her mom."
"So what's next? How does the actual breaking happen? A ritual? Magic words?"
Walter gave Hillary a searching look.
"That's your area of expertise, right?"
Hillary took another sip and shook her head. "I was thinking we'd try Glenda. She certainly has some answers, if we can reach her." Brad looked from Hillary to Walter.
Who's going to dial?
Walter picked up his phone.
Let's give this fancy new phone a try, why don't we? What's the lady's number?
Glenda opened her compact, but before she made the call, she took a second to compose herself. She wasn't ready, wasn't certain every piece was in exactly the right place, but it was the best she could do.
Adele?
No answer.
Adele, I know you hear me.
Silence. Very quietly, almost a whisper, certainly a plea, Glenda said,
My friend, please.
The tiny mirror in her hands shimmered to life. Why now, after 7 years of silence? Glenda closed her eyes as a sadness washed through her.
Your silence, dear friend. I have always been here, ready to listen.
A lie. You didn't understand then, and you won't understand now because you refuse to hear me. The mirror in Glenda's hands turned a stormy gray, reflecting the passion in Adele's voice.
I'm listening now.
He doesn't deserve her. He never did. Adele's voice was cold, the passion now gone.
That was always for Grace to decide, and you must know the memory charm is broken.
No. The chill in Adele's voice, the controlled violence practically cracked the small glass. An error. Glenda had believed Adele would already be aware, but she pushed forward.
Yes, today. He remembers. He has mourned, and he treasures his memory of their shared love even now.
Impossible. The return of his memory should have been prevented. Cold and dispassionate, Adele spoke of the boy's planned death as if it meant nothing.
Your killing curse failed. I made certain of it.
Glenda's fingers clenched the mirror tightly. Her heart ached that her friend had changed so much.
Adele, you must make this right. For Grace, for yourself. You have to meet the boy. You have to fix this.
I will not. Implacable, spoken with a chilly calm. Glenda's heart broke a little more, but needs must.
Meet with the Sherwood boy. Listen to what he says. If you refuse, I will report the killing curse you placed upon him to the council and ensure that any damage you inflict, no matter the cost, will be undone.
Glenda's threat equated to a death sentence. In undoing Adele's curse, she would most likely undo Adele herself, so tightly were the two bound. But even this might fail, for Glenda was no longer certain the woman still held any regard for her own life. The compact grew cold in Glenda's hands. Perhaps she had miscalculated. Had she waited too long? Had the woman's pain overtaken her so fully that it was all that remained? A frosty film covered the tiny makeup mirror. I'll go, her childhood friend said, and then the mirror in Glenda's hand shattered into small pieces. Gramps put the phone on speaker. It rang several times, but no one picked up. It was well past the Good Witch's regular hours, but then it had been when Hillary had called before. The phone buzzed. You've got a text, Brad said, but then he looked at Hillary in confusion. She shrugged. Brad was right. She was the one most likely to be texting her grandpa. Then she remembered the text with the virtual memorial web address. She grabbed the phone off the counter and swiped at the screen with a little too much force.
Brad, speak from your heart. Walter, answer your door.
She flipped the phone around so Brad and Gramps could read the message. Is that what I think it is? Hillary asked. Words of wisdom from Glenda? I bet so. Brad pointed at Gramps. You probably should answer the door. The doorbell rang. An eerie silence fell, then suddenly all three of them moved toward the door at once. Rather than jostle one another, or run into the cold, dense airspace that was Brad, Gramps went first. He also opened the door, but she and Brad were right behind him. A pink sundress, a pastel-fitted sweater, cute sandals. Not what Hillary expected from the wickedest witch in Texas. Adele Galloway looked like a soccer mom. All 5 feet 3 inches of her. Hillary had just catalogued the shiny blonde bob and the pink lip gloss when she made her way to Adele's eyes. Cold, hard, passionless. Not good. Hillary casually inched closer to Brad. This woman was no soccer mom.
Mrs. Galloway?
Gramps asked. He didn't offer his hand, but when she inclined her head, he opened the door wider and stepped to the side.
Please, come in.
The group marched into the living room and spread out into 3 areas. Adele was the furthest from both Brad and Hillary, where they'd clumped together near the sofa, and Gramps was awkwardly placed between them. Adele smiled, but it didn't touch her eyes. I'm here. I'm listening. Oddly, she seemed to be addressing the mirror hanging above the sofa. Brad exchanged a quick look with Hillary, then said, I'm sorry for your loss, Adele. I never had the chance to tell you before. I had no wish to speak with you then, nor do I now. But know this. Her gaze moved from the mirror and pinned Brad with a laser-like focus. Your circumstances are of your own making. Brad looked stumped. If you think the accident could have been prevented, I think you should have been prevented. You never should have been in her life. You didn't understand what you had and certainly didn't deserve it. Adele's gaze had again moved to the mirror. Hillary glanced nervously at the mirror, but it looked the same as it always had, like a normal mirror. She thought her grandmother had put it in there to make the room look bigger. Epic fail. The room felt much, much too small right now. I know this may not be of great comfort, but she was happy. She knew she was loved, and she was happy. Brad looked incredibly sad. Looking at him, Hillary realized Grace may have died 8 years ago, and that event may be in the distant past, but he'd only recently regained his memories of her. He must still be dealing with his grief. And to have this horrible woman and her nasty curse to contend with on top of that, ugh, she would shoot the evil witch if she had a gun. Good thing Gramps had a gun safe, or she'd be looking at some serious time in the pokey. You say she was happy. All I know is that she's dead. She left to be with you, and now she's dead. Adele's cold, dispassionate response wasn't what Hillary would have expected from a mother speaking of a child's death. A shimmer from the mirror caught Hillary's eye, and she turned to see that it was emitting a soft glow. Glenda's voice emanated from the mirror's surface. You say I don't hear? Listen to yourself, Adele. Hear yourself speaking. Your daughter didn't abandon you for the Sherwood boy. She had enough love for both of you. No, she didn't. We'd argued. She said she didn't want to choose, but I was making her. She chose him. Adele turned a nasty look on Brad. And look what you did. You took that gift like it was nothing. And now she's gone. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Brad sank down onto the edge of the sofa. He seemed to carefully consider his words. I do know she loved you, and you both would have worked out your differences. But something terrible happened before you could do that. We never had that chance. Now she's gone, and she left this world with hate in her heart for her own mother. You made her hate. No, she could never hate you. Brad was speaking, but Adele wasn't listening. And then Hillary drew a connection. A parallel she hadn't seen but seemed especially relevant now. Steve has a mother. Adele's gaze flew to Hillary, and her eyes narrowed to slits, but she didn't say anything. Steve's mom has no idea where he is. The police think he killed himself because he disappeared on the anniversary of your daughter's death, but there's no body. Hillary swallowed. She was rambling a little, but Adele was listening, for now. So there's no body. That means that Steve's mom doesn't know if he's alive or dead. But it's been years, so by now she's probably thinking he's dead. She might even have started to believe that he killed himself. And she'll wonder if she could have done something, said something. She'll wonder why he didn't ask for help. Or if he did and she missed it. Hillary gulped, swallowing past a huge lump in her throat. You've stolen another mother's child away from her. Hillary had been talking so fast, trying to keep Adele's attention, that she'd run out of breath. But she'd also run out of things to say. What else could she say to appeal to a woman so cold? But Adele's face had changed. There was no sympathy there, but she'd lost the rigid, tense look. Now her face was blank. The mirror lit up from within, and Glenda spoke. Spare the woman some pain. You've had your solitary grief for 7 years. Let this boy's mother know some peace. As Glenda spoke, the corners of Adele's mouth slowly turned down until her face looked simply tired. Do this because it's right. Glenda's voice made ripples across the mirror's surface. Adele's face tensed, then she sneered. I do this because I choose to live. This is not right. But Hillary thought she might be lying. She wasn't sure what threats Glenda had made and why Adele thought her own life was on the line, but she had seen the change in her when the focus had shifted from Brad to his mom. If the crazy, powerful witch lady needed an excuse to break her curse, okay. Wait, where'd she go? Hillary hadn't even blinked. Adele had been there, and then she was gone. Don't know, don't care, Brad said just a fraction of a second before he grabbed Hillary in a bear hug and swung her around in a circle. Oh, be danged. Gramps gave a happy little hoot. Brad set her down and let go of her. She was a little light-headed because he was real, solid, totally substantial, not ghostly. Wow. Brad had already walked over to her grandpa and given the old guy a huge hug by the time her head had stopped spinning. That was it. Hillary felt like the queen of obvious, but someone had to say something. Brad laughed and clapped his hands together. A satisfyingly loud sound resulted. That's right. That was it. A huge grin was plastered across his face, revealing that adorable dimple she'd only caught a few times. Chapter 19. Hillary had left Gramps and Brad toasting each other, repeatedly. Brad had been bodiless for more than 7 years, and the first thing he did with his newly reacquired physical self was to get drunk with her grandpa. Pretty funny, actually, but not her gig. After giving Beth an update, she sank lower in her warm bath. After a good night's sleep, she'd feel much better. Unfortunately, Brad wouldn't be so lucky. He had some difficult questions to answer and a lot of planning to do. A man can't disappear off the planet for 7 years, suddenly reappear, and expect no repercussions. And all of that had to be sorted before he could reach out to his mom. Rotten stuff on the heels of such a smashing victory. She could see the appeal of a few drinks and a night of celebration before tackling those new challenges. Hillary waffled on her opinion of Glenda. She finally got why Beth was so forgiving of the busybody witch's antics, and all it had taken was her rescue of the guy Hillary was falling for. Too bad he was recently bereaved, sort of, and definitely busy with larger concerns. She ducked her head underwater, letting the muffled water sounds wash over her. The faint sound of her cell ringing penetrated the water, but she ignored it. When she surfaced, bubbles clinging to her ears and nose, the ringing had stopped. Whoever it was, whatever it was, could wait. After snoozing for a few minutes in the tub and waking to cool water, Hillary climbed out and made short work of prepping for bed. Only when she woke, 10 hours later, did she see the voicemail message from her Aunt Carol. Fully recharged from an excellent night's rest and a practically perky message from her aunt enthusiastically endorsing her and Gramps' plan, her day was already overflowing with good vibes. About time. She was due some after the last few days. Then reality reared its head. A perky Aunt Carol? It was enough to boggle the mind. She groaned and picked up the phone. She'd phoned to give Gramps a heads up she was coming over. He hadn't answered, but she got a text a few minutes later. Come on in. Don't knock, please. Brad. Great. She'd be breaking news to 2 seriously hungover men. Fun times. She parked in Gramps' drive and slammed her car door. Serve them right. She let herself in and managed not to slam the door, but the urge was strong. Hey guys, it's me. She followed her nose to the kitchen where the smell of cooking bacon made her mouth water. Hey, Gramps. She gave him a one-armed hug as he flipped the cooking bacon. Where's Brad?
He ran out for a minute.
Sorry, in your car? Hillary took Gramps' sheepish look as affirmation. She shook her head. I can't believe you're letting a guy who hasn't driven in 7 years cruise around town in your car. Maybe we should commit your crazy old man butt.
Watch it, Peanut. I won't let you have any bacon if you keep that up.
Ouch, that is cruel. Hillary snapped off a piece of one of the cooked slices cooling on a plate next to the stove. That's seriously cruel.
You're in a good humor this morning.
I got some decent sleep last night, and I have some good news. Brad walked in from the front of the house holding a pot of lavender. "Good news. I'm just in time." He handed the pot to her, looking a little uncomfortable. "This is for you." She never got flowers from anyone except her parents, and she loved lavender. She could feel herself blushing, which was just silly. "Thank you. I love lavender."
He knows.
Gramps had moved from bacon to frying eggs. "Thanks, Walter. If you could not mention things that make me seem like a creepy stalker guy, that would be helpful." He turned to Hillary. "It's not much, given everything you've done for me. I'm pretty sure that when you mentioned my mom, you saved my bacon." He gave her a crooked smile. "But since I'm temporarily without a driver's license, a car, a place to live—"
"Hey, now, you've got a place here as long as you need it."
Gramps used his best stern yet earnest voice. It was a hard voice to argue with.
"That was true before, and it's still true."
"I didn't have to eat before, but the sentiment is much appreciated, Walter." Hillary set the pot down on the counter, but not before she took a second to smell the fragrant flowers. The familiar smell made her smile. "About your living situation, Gramps, I missed a call from Aunt Carol, and I got this bizarro, chipper message from her agreeing to our plan." "Bizarro?" Brad asked.
"Carol isn't a chipper person by nature,"
Gramps clarified. He started to plate the eggs.
"Go on. What had her all excited?"
"Well, she'll probably swing by later today to talk to you, but she and her husband have been planning a move out of state. She's been worried about leaving Texas with you in the house by yourself and still telling Brad stories. And if she's concerned—"
"Tim's concerned."
Gramps nodded his head. He may think well of his children, but he wasn't totally blind. "You got it," she said.
"Let me guess. You told her you'd be moving in when your lease expires, and she thought she'd won the lottery?"
Gramps shook his head. Bacon and eggs delivered, he said.
"Go on. Eat while it's hot."
"Oh, more than that." She spoke in between mouthfuls of bacon. "She offered to buy out my lease so I could move in with you before she and her husband move away, which is excellent news because I'd rather not have to foot that bill. I need all my pennies to start updates on the house." Hillary couldn't help the self-satisfied smile that thought produced. Gramps cringed.
"It's nice the way it is."
Hillary and Brad both said, "No," then laughed. When they'd gotten their laughter under control, Gramps did his best not to look offended by their disdain of his 1970s decor and said,
"And Tim's fine with all this because Carol is, right?"
"Of course. You know Carol has been the one pushing for a resolution. Everyone's thrilled. Problem solved."
"And Lady Shrink visit is canceled."
Gramps looked so relieved she hated to burst his bubble. "No," Hillary mumbled around a mouth of egg. "She still thinks you're crazy pants, but on the right side, she might cancel the appointment after she meets Brad this afternoon. Or you can just refuse to go because she doesn't have leverage now." Brad sat down at the kitchen table.
"Whoa, meet Aunt Carol? Is that a good idea? I mean, what do I tell her? I can't even show the woman my ID."
The doorbell rang, and Brad's complexion turned several shades lighter. "That's her, isn't it?" "No chance," Hillary said as she stood up. "Finish your breakfast, Gramps." As she walked out of the room, Hillary heard Gramps trying to explain Carol's fascination with time and schedules and the unlikelihood of her showing up early. When she got to the door, no one was there. But as she opened it to have a better look, a large envelope that had been propped against the door fell across the threshold of the house. Brad's name was handwritten in large letters across it. When she got back to the kitchen, Gramps had disappeared and it was just Brad. She handed the envelope. "Definitely, Glenda. No one else could possibly know you're here." Once opened, it was startlingly clear the package was from Glenda. Who else but she would have the resources to create proof of a fictional life over a 7-year period? The mysterious package resolved some of the issues Brad would be facing over the next few weeks. Inside were medical documents evidencing the diagnosis of and a course of treatment for amnesia. It wouldn't answer every question, and it certainly made Brad's pending reunion with his mother no less heart-wrenching, but it helped fill in some gaps. And the medical records provided more of an answer than, "By the way, magic is real, and nasty curses are too." In addition to the medical records, the package had yielded various forms of identification. A sticky note on his driver's license held the following message: "Amnesia cured 2016. Tech glitch. Previous prints lost." That might explain how he'd stayed a John Doe and off the grid for so long, but questions bounced through her head. How will any of this hold up under scrutiny?
I'm guessing pretty well with the aid of some witch-powered magic.
Brad stood next to her, examining the documents and then handing each one to her after he'd scanned it. I suppose so, but she hardly sounded convinced. It's worked so far for Edward, and all of his documentation came from Glenda. She moved closer to read a medical document in his hand, but he set it down. His eyes met with hers as he tipped up her chin. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, he lowered his head. That's when she realized she was about to be kissed. It took her that long. Then she closed her eyes, all the better to savor the press of his lips on hers, the mingling of warm breaths, the nip of teeth on her bottom lip, the taste of him. Several minutes later, Brad said, "Hillary." Her arms were wrapped around his neck. That and a firm hand on her waist held her upright. She couldn't remember when her knees had stopped functioning, only knew they had. Brad leaned away from her and she opened her eyes.
I'm completely broke, have no job, and no idea how I'm going to fit back into the normal world.
She'd just been kissed senseless, so she was having a hard time following his train of thought. Sorry? And she was, but now seemed an odd time for him to mention those things. He leaned down, so close to her ear that his breath tickled a shiver out of her as he quietly spoke.
So, given the sad state of my affairs, any chance for a date?
Now she got it. She tried not to giggle when she thought of some of the aimless guys she'd dated in the past. While she found them exciting and wonderful at the time, and she was sure they were someone's Mr. Right, they hadn't been hers. There was simply no comparison between those men and Brad. He wasn't aimless, anything but. He'd kept an amazing attitude through 7 years of inhuman conditions, all the while acting as a loyal and trustworthy friend to one of the people she loved best in this world. Reintegration into everyday life would be challenging, she was sure, but she'd be there to help, and she had complete faith in him. Yeah, I think I can manage that. She didn't even try to hide her ridiculously wide smile. Epilogue. Glenda crossed her legs, uncrossed them, then crossed them again. She tapped a manicured nail on the countertop, sending the mirror covert glances she kept tapping. Finally, the mirror shimmered.
The council has heard Adele's testimony and her apology.
Bedivere's deep voice betrayed no emotion. Did they believe her? What was the sentence?
Her apology was most heartfelt. 20 years probation, but only because the killing curse failed. I suspect her probationary period was greatly reduced as a direct result of her voluntary surrender to the council. A surprising turn of events.
Glenda felt the tension ease from her body. Yes, very accommodating of her to save the council the trouble of tracking her down.
Not that she had any help making that decision.
His words barely moved the mirror's surface. Glenda bit her lip. No, not at all. She must have had a true change of heart. A sigh shimmered across the mirror.
Glenda.
Some of the tension returned to her shoulders. Interfering with the council could have unpleasant consequences, and Glenda had never ruffled the feathers of that great body. Several members were rather fond of Glenda, but their influence was not absolute. Finally, Bedivere spoke.
This plan you cobbled together, it had more moving pieces than you disclosed. You implied a spell, a potion, my potion, and some predictive math. But, in fact, it was much more complicated.
Yes, Glenda said. Agreement and minimal explanation seemed a wise choice.
If the Sherwood boy had been less... Well, if he'd simply been less, the plan would have fallen completely apart. And if the girl hadn't cared for the boy...
But Sherwood was a good man, and he's still a good man. 7 years didn't change that fact. Glenda had schemed, manipulated circumstances, and twisted the curse to make sure of it. And the girl was always a good match for him. We simply altered circumstances to allow that match to happen.
I assume there was either no loophole in the curse or you were unable to generate the triggering circumstances. But engineering Adele's disillusion of the curse, daring at the very least. It seems that much was left to chance in this grand plan of yours.
Not nearly so much as you might think. It relied upon the math, my dear Bedivere.
Predictive math does have its uses.
The mirror started to lose its shine, a sign the call was ending, but then the magic within flared to life again.
And Glenda, you obviously had your eye on the Sherwood boy and correspondingly Hillary for some time. Some great time. Hence your familiarity with Beth and the resulting match with Edward. An important circumstance you concealed from me. Don't hide such facts from me in future.
I wouldn't dream of it, she said, then pulled the magic away from the mirror, ending the call from her end for a change. Glenda was feeling cheeky. She'd saved 2 lives and made an excellent match. It was a good day. This has been Ghostly Love, The Good Witch Matchmaker, Book 2. Written by Kate Lawley. Narrated by Sonia Field. Copyright 2016 by Catherine G. Cobb. Production copyright 2016 by Catherine G. Cobb.